Elias Crow pointed his finger directly at Evelyn Hart's face, right there in the middle of the road, in front of every soul in Harrow Bend, and said, loudly enough that the horses flinched, I ordered one woman, not a circus. The crowd went still. The three children stood behind Evelyn in the dust, a 9-year-old boy holding a battered trunk, a 6-year-old girl clutching her mother's coat, and a baby wrapped in worn flannel. Evelyn did not look away. She did not apologize. But her jaw was tight, and the baby on her hip made a small sound. And the boy reached down and took his sister's hand without being asked. Elias turned to the stagecoach driver. Take them back. No hesitation. No lowering of his voice. No acknowledgement that the woman in front of him had traveled 400 miles, spent her last coin, and told her children this was the start of something better. If that had been you standing in that dust, what would you have done? If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next. We have more stories that will shake you to your core. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us the city or country you're watching from. We want to see just how far this story travels. The stagecoach from Billings arrived 11 minutes late, which was the first thing that went wrong on the morning of April, the 3rd, 1887. Elias Crow had been standing outside Harrow Bend's post office since 9:15, which was itself unusual. Elias did not ordinarily stand anywhere long enough to be noticed. He moved through town the way a weather front moves, purposeful, heavy, not particularly interested in what it passed over. He bought his supplies at Mercer's, settled his accounts at the bank, and was back on his horse and headed north before most men had finished their second cup of coffee. He had done this for 7 years. People had long since stopped expecting more from him. But today he was standing still. He had his hat in his hands, which the people of Harrow Bend noticed because Elias Crow was not a man who removed his hat except at the table and at gravesites. He was 41 years old. His face had the look of terrain that had weathered several difficult seasons, not ugly, but not soft either. There were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting at distances, and a scar along his jaw from a fence wire incident he had never bothered explaining to anyone. His hands were the size of small shovels and had the same utility. He was waiting for his bride. This had been Marcus Dillard's idea, or rather Marcus had planted the idea in the way that men with easy opinions plant things in harder men, carelessly and with full confidence that they'd take root. Marcus ran the feed store and had married a woman from a correspondence agency out of St. Louis 4 years prior and had not stopped mentioning her virtues since. His wife Clara made excellent pie and kept immaculate accounts, and had apparently transformed Marcus from a disorganized mutton-head bachelor into a disorganized mutton-headed husband with pie. Marcus considered this a significant improvement. You need someone to manage the house, Marcus had told Elias last October, leaning on his own counter with the authority of a man who had recently eaten a good breakfast. The Harrow Agency has women, good women, widows mostly, some young. They fill out a form. You fill out a form, the agency makes a match. Simple as arithmetic. Elias had looked at him the way he looked at most unsolicited advice, like it was a poorly made fence, and he was calculating whether it was worth the effort to fix it or simply to walk around it. I don't need managing, he said. Your house does, Marcus said. When's the last time you had a hot meal that you didn't cook yourself? Elias hadn't answered that, which was itself an answer. He'd gone home and thought about it for 3 weeks, which was how Elias processed most decisions. Then he had written a letter to the Harrow Correspondence Agency in a hand that was clear and economical, and said precisely what he meant. He wanted a woman who was capable, honest, and not given to complaint. He had a working ranch, 1,200 acres of grazing land, a house that required maintenance he had no time for, and no patience for sentiment. He was not romantic. He was practical. If she was practical in return, they would manage fine. He had received a letter back from one Evelyn Hart of Fayetteville, Arkansas, 2 months later. It was written in a neat, controlled hand and said she was 33 years old, a widow, experienced with cooking, mending, livestock care, and keeping household accounts. She was capable, she wrote, and she did not complain. She had not mentioned the children. He had written back. She had written back. 4 letters total, none of them long. He had told her about the ranch, the winters, the distances. She had told him she wasn't afraid of hard work or cold weather. The agency had handled the paperwork. He had sent money for the stage fare. He had not asked if there was anything else he ought to know. This was, he would later understand, a significant failure of thoroughness. Elias Crow was a thorough man in most things. He checked fence lines and water levels and the health of every animal on his property with careful regularity. He had not applied the same rigor to the matter of the woman he was bringing 400 miles to be his wife, which was the kind of oversight that lives in a man's chest for a long time afterward. The stage arrived in a cloud of road dust and the ordinary noise of a vehicle that had been pushed too hard across uncertain terrain. The driver hauled back on the reins and the horses settled, blowing hard. 3 or 4 townspeople had drifted close, not conspicuously, but close enough. Word had gotten around that Elias Crow was expecting a bride, which was the kind of information that Harrow Bend found it impossible to be neutral about. Elias had lived alone on that ranch for 7 years without showing interest in any woman in town. The fact that he had written away for one was already being discussed in some detail. The stage door opened. A woman stepped down. She was not what anyone had imagined, though no one would have been able to say precisely what they had imagined. She was slim and straight-backed, and wore a gray travel dress that had been mended at the left sleeve, with thread that was slightly the wrong shade. Her hair was dark and pulled back tightly. Her face showed the specific tiredness of someone who had been traveling for a very long time, and had decided some miles back that exhaustion was a feeling rather than a fact and had put it aside. She had a baby on her hip. Elias looked at the baby. The baby looked at Elias with the frank, assessing stare that very young children reserve for strangers. The baby had dark eyes and a small strand of dark hair that had worked loose from its wrapping. Then a boy dropped from the stage step behind the woman 9 years old, lean and deliberate, hauling a battered trunk with both hands, his jaw set with the particular stubbornness of a child who has decided he is the man of a situation. And then a small girl 6 years old, red-cheeked from travel, her coat buttoned crooked, one hand reaching immediately for her mother's sleeve. Elias counted them, 1 woman, 3 children. The smallest was perhaps 9 months old. The silence that followed was not a natural quiet. It was the specific silence of a crowd that has just understood something and is waiting to see what the man at the center of it will do. Elias put his hat back on his head. This was not a conscious act, it was the reflex of a man who has just shifted from a civilian posture to something harder and more defended. He looked at Evelyn Hart. She looked back at him. She did not flinch, and she did not smile, and she did not apologize, which was the most honest thing she did in those first 20 seconds, and also the thing that made everything that came after both harder and more inevitable. Her chin was slightly elevated. Her arm was around the baby. She knew exactly what she had not told him. "You're Elias Crow," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said, a pause. Around them, Harrow Bend held its breath. "I'm Evelyn Hart, I can see that," Elias said. Then, without looking away from her, "You didn't mention children." "No," she said, "I didn't." He waited for more, an explanation, a defense, a negotiation. She offered none of these things. She simply stood in the road dust with 3 children and a mended sleeve, and looked at him with eyes that were neither pleading nor defiant, just clear and steady and utterly exhausted beneath the surface. Something moved across Elias's face. It was not a readable thing. Then he turned to look at the stagecoach driver, who was watching from the box with the careful neutrality of a man who wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. "Take them back," Elias said. His voice carried. It was built to carry low, flat, and without drama, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted. The boy with the trunk stopped moving. The little girl pressed closer to her mother's coat. Evelyn's arm tightened around the baby, a small involuntary motion that she controlled almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. Then he turned back to Evelyn and said it directly. Without the mercy of speaking around her, "I ordered 1 woman." Not a circus, the crowd made no sound. Evelyn did not step back. Her face went through something, a flash of something raw and quick that she shut down before it had a chance to become visible to anyone but a person, looking very closely, and then her expression was composed again. Too composed. The kind of composed that takes years of practice and a particular history to achieve. "I understand," she said quietly. "Do you?" Elias said. "Not a question, yes." She shifted the baby. "We'll wait for the next stage." "Good." He was already turning away. Already done with the matter, in the way that men who have decided something consider themselves entitled to be done with it. He had an order of fence post iron to collect at Mercer's, and a 3-hour ride home, and no patience for the mechanics of how Evelyn Hart would manage the situation she had created. She was capable, she had written, she could manage. He had taken perhaps 4 steps when it happened. The little girl, the 6-year-old with the crooked coat buttons, let go of her mother's sleeve. She did it without looking at her mother, without asking permission, without any apparent plan. She simply crossed the road to where Elias Crow was walking and took his hand. His hand was twice the size of hers. He stopped walking. She looked up at him with brown eyes that had the same directness as her mother's, though without the layer of management over them. She was a child. She had not yet learned to control what showed on her face. "You look sad," she said. "Mama says nobody should have to be sad alone." The road was quiet. Elias Crow stood in the middle of the main street of Harrow Bend, with a 6-year-old girl holding 2 of his fingers, and looked down at her. His face did not change, not in any way that most people in that crowd would have been able to point to. But something behind his eyes shifted. Something that had been fixed for a very long time moved, the way a thing shifts when a crack in the earth allows water through that has nowhere else to go. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he looked up at Evelyn Hart, who had not moved, who was watching him with the careful stillness of a woman who is not going to intervene in something her child has started, because she cannot afford to make it worse. "What's her name?" he said. Evelyn's voice came out steady. "Nora." He looked back down at the child. Nora looked back up at him, unhurried and unafraid, still holding his 2 fingers. "Nora," he said, and then in a voice that had something different in it that he almost certainly did not intend, "Let go of my hand." "Okay," Nora said. She let go. He was quiet for another moment. Then he turned toward Mercer's feed store. "You can wait inside," he said, and it was unclear whether he was speaking to Nora or to all of them, and perhaps he meant it to be unclear. "There's a bench." He walked away and did not look back. Round Evelyn, Harrow Bend exhaled. She did not look at the crowd. She adjusted Rose on her hip, glanced at Caleb, who was still holding the trunk, whose expression said he had understood more of what just happened than she would have wished, and held out her free hand to Nora. "Come on, sweetheart," she said quietly. Nora took her hand and walked with her toward Mercer's without apparent distress, as though she had simply completed a task and was ready for the next thing. Evelyn did not look at the crowd, and the crowd did not speak to her, and the morning continued around them like water continuing around a stone. Inside Mercer's, the bench was against the far wall, beside a display of seed catalog. It was a functional bench unpainted, slightly rough and not particularly clean. Evelyn sat on it with Rose in her lap, and Nora pressed against her side, and Caleb sitting straight backed at the end with his hands on his knees, watching the door. Evelyn had not cried. She was not going to cry, not here, not in front of her children in a town where she had just been publicly called a circus. She had enough practice at putting grief and humiliation in their proper places that the practice had become nearly automatic. It was not a good skill to have perfected, but it was the one she had. She touched Nora's hair. Nora looked up at her. "Mama," Nora said, "he didn't actually want us to leave." Evelyn said. He would have just walked away, but he stopped. Evelyn looked at her 6-year-old daughter and tried to decide how much of this she wanted to address. She settled on, "People are complicated, sweetheart." "He's sad," Nora said with the certainty of someone who had gathered sufficient evidence. "We don't know him, Nora." "His eyes are sad." Nora said this with perfect confidence and returned to looking at the seed catalog display, apparently finished with the subject. Caleb had not spoken. He was still watching the door. He was 9 years old and built like Evelyn's husband had been, not large, but economical. Like every part of him had been put where it would be most useful. He had Thomas's eyes too, which Evelyn found easier some days than others. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "We're going to be fine." He nodded, but it was the nod of a boy who had been told this enough times that he had stopped parsing it for meaning and had started parsing it for what it revealed about how bad things were. He was 9. He had been 9 for 6 months, long enough to have developed a 9-year-old's particular sensitivity to the gap between what adults said and what they meant. Rose made a small sound, and Evelyn bounced her gently, and Rose subsided into the drowse of a baby who has spent most of her life being carried through uncertain circumstances and has made peace with this. The door opened. Evelyn looked up, expecting Elias Crow, and instead saw a woman late 50s, broad-shouldered, wearing an apron that had been washed so many times it had gone from whatever color it started as to a pale approximation of itself. She was carrying a tin cup and a small plate with 2 biscuits on it. "Name's Vera," the woman said. She set the cup and plate on the bench beside Evelyn without ceremony. "Water and biscuits. Children look like they've had a long ride." Evelyn looked at her. "Thank you." Vera looked at Evelyn with the frank assessment of a woman who has seen enough of life that she trusts her own eyes over other people's narratives. What she saw, apparently, was something that satisfied her, because she nodded once. "Elias Crow is a difficult man," Vera said, keeping her voice low. "But he's not a bad one. People here mix those 2 things up regular." She paused. "The next stage is Thursday." "Yes," Evelyn said, "I know." 4 days, Vera looked at the children, then back at Evelyn. "You have money for boarding?" The pause before Evelyn answered was brief. Vera caught it anyway. "There's space above the feed store," Vera said. "My husband won't fuss about it." "I can't accept charity," Evelyn said. Not proud, she said it the same way she said most things, factually and without excess. "It's not charity," Vera said. "I'll take a meal. If you can cook half as well as I expect you can, we'll call it even." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "Then what makes you think I can cook?" Vera pointed at Evelyn's hands. "Those aren't the hands of a woman who doesn't cook." She turned toward the door. "Come find me when you're ready." She left without waiting for an answer. Nora reached for a biscuit. Evelyn let her have it and broke the other one into pieces for Caleb, who took them without comment but ate with the focused efficiency of a child who has learned not to waste food when it appears. Elias did not go back to the bench. He collected his iron at Mercer's and settled the account and spent an hour discussing the price of alfalfa with Marcus Dillard, who clearly wanted to discuss something else entirely, and had the discipline of a man who knew that pushing Elias Crow on a sensitive subject was the fastest way to end a conversation. By noon, Elias was on his horse headed north toward the ranch. He told himself, handled it correctly. He had not been cruel, he had been clear, which was more than most men would have managed in the same situation. He had made an arrangement with a woman who had misrepresented herself, and the arrangement was null, and she would take the Thursday stage and go back to wherever she came from. He had offered a bench. That was sufficient. He rode for an hour. He passed the north fence line, which needed work on the third post, which he had noted 3 days ago and had not yet addressed. He passed the creek, which was running higher than usual for April. He passed the stand of cottonwoods at the edge of the upper pasture. He was thinking about fence posts. He was not thinking about a 6-year-old girl who had crossed a road and taken his hand. He was not thinking about that at all. The ranch came into view, the main house, the barn, the 2 outbuildings, the corral where 3 horses stood in the afternoon light. He had built the corral himself. After. He had rebuilt most of the property. After. In the specific way that men who have lost something immovable sometimes try to construct motion in themselves through the sheer labor of physical work. He had learned the outer edges of his own grief this way. The same way you learn the edge of a property by walking it, not because walking it does anything to the grass, but because you need to know where the line is. He unsaddled the horse and put her up and went into the house. It was quiet. It was always quiet. This was a fact, not a complaint. He had stopped qualifying it as a complaint some time ago. He made coffee, which was the same coffee he made every afternoon, in the same pot, the same way. He drank it standing at the window, looking at the upper pasture where the cottonwoods were starting to show their spring color. Yellow-green and tentative, every April the same. He thought about the boy's face when he'd said, "Take them back." He drank his coffee. He thought about the way the woman had adjusted the baby, that one small movement that she'd tried to keep invisible. He had been looking at her face. He had been looking for the thing she would do that would tell him what kind of woman she was, whether she would plead or argue or perform distress for the crowd's benefit. She had done none of those things. She had said, "I understand," and she had said, "We'll wait for the next stage," and she had not looked at the crowd, not once. That was a particular kind of pride. Not the fragile kind. The kind that has already been tested enough times that it no longer requires an audience to hold its shape. He did not think about Nora. He was not thinking about Nora. He put down the coffee cup. He was back on his horse by 2:30. He did not go directly back to Harrow Bend. He told himself he was going to check the south fence, and he did check the south fence, and then he was in Harrow Bend, and he did not examine the reasoning behind this sequence of events with any particular rigor. Vera Kettrick was in front of the feed store, sweeping. She looked up at him without surprise, which annoyed him. "They still here," he said. "Above the store," Vera said. "Where they'll sleep tonight and tomorrow and the night after that. Unless something changes." Elias looked at the building. "She have money." "Not much." "What she need?" Vera stopped sweeping and looked at him with the expression of a woman who is choosing carefully. "How much to say?" "What she needs," Vera said, "is a situation that doesn't fall apart on her. She's had enough of those." He sat on his horse for a moment. "I don't know anything about her." "You know what she does in a hard moment," Vera said. "Some people you can know for years and not find that out." Elias looked at the building for another moment. Then the boy. "What's he like?" Vera considered. "Watches everything. Quiet, protective of the little ones." She paused. "Reminds me of someone." He didn't ask who. "The Thursday stage," he said. "Yes," Vera said. "Thursday." He nodded once and rode back to the north end of town, where he sat outside the bank for 10 minutes doing nothing in particular, which was not like him, and then he went home. That night, alone in the ranch house, Elias Crow did something he had not done in 2 years. He went to the back bedroom, the room he did not use, the one that had been a child's room once, which he kept closed because the closed door was easier to manage than what was behind it, and he opened the door. There was a small bed, a wooden horse on the floor by the window, a pair of small boots, still there from 7 years ago, because taking them away had always required more will than he had on any given day, so they stayed. He had come in here and taken the boots to the trash once, 3 years back, and made it as far as the barn before he'd turned around and put them back. He stood in the doorway and did not go in. He looked at the boots for a while. Then he pulled the door closed and went to his own room and lay on the bed with his boots on, which was a habit Constance had never been able to break him of and had eventually stopped trying to, and he looked at the ceiling. He thought about what the child had said. "You look sad." He had not, in 7 years, had a 6-year-old look up at him and say something true to his face with that kind of certainty. Children did not often speak to Elias Crow. He had a face and a manner that discouraged it. He thought about her small hand on his fingers. He thought about Constance. He thought about Thomas. He thought about April, 4 years earlier than this one, which he always thought about in April, which was one of the reasons April was his least favorite month. He was not going to change anything. He had made his decision. The woman had misrepresented the arrangement, and on Thursday she would take the stage back to Fayetteville, and that would be the end of it. He was going to sleep. He did not sleep for a long time. In the morning he rode into Harrow Bend again, which he told himself was because he needed salt blocks, which he did need, and had nothing to do with anything else. He collected the salt blocks from Mercer's. He was tying them to the saddle when the door above the feed store opened, and Caleb came down the outside stairs with a bucket, heading for the water pump in the side yard. The boy saw him. He stopped. They looked at each other across the small distance of the side yard. Caleb was 19 years old and had the specific wariness of a child who has learned to read situations quickly, because quick reading is a survival skill when the situations around you change often and without much warning. Elias said, "You sleep all right." It was an odd thing to say. He said it anyway. Caleb considered the question with more seriousness than it deserved, or perhaps exactly the seriousness it deserved. Rose cried some. "She does that." Teething, Elias said. Caleb nodded. Mama walks her a pause. The pump was 10 feet away. Caleb seemed to be calculating whether continuing toward it constituted some kind of permission that hadn't been granted. "Go ahead," Elias said. The boy went to the pump and filled the bucket with the efficiency of a child, who has been doing this kind of task long enough that it no longer requires his full attention. Then he picked up the full bucket and looked at Elias again. "We're not trying to make trouble," Caleb said. "I know that," Elias said. "My mother didn't tell you about us because she thought you'd say no. She needed—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that was too old for 9. She needed this to work out. Elias looked at the boy for a moment. "Why? Because there's nothing to go back to," Caleb said. Simply. Not performing the tragedy of it, just stating it the way you state a fact about weather or terrain. Elias untied and retied one of the knots on the salt block, which did not need retying. "Your father 2 years ago," Caleb said. "Fever." He paused. "And then the house. And then most of the rest of it." He picked up the bucket. "I'm not asking you to change anything. I just wanted you to know she's not a bad person. She just ran out of options." He carried the bucket back up the stairs without waiting to be dismissed, which was the correct thing to do, and showed a certain amount of judgment. Elias stood by his horse for a moment. Then he went inside Mercer's and bought 3 more things he had not come for, which was unusual, and went home. That afternoon he rode out to check the north fence and spent 2 hours doing it properly, pulling the bad posts and resetting them in the way that is deeply physical and deeply mindless at once, and therefore useful when you are trying not to think about something specific. He worked until the light went flat and his shoulders had settled into the specific ache of sufficient labor, and then he sat on the fence rail and looked at the valley. The valley was wide and open and ran north for 12 miles before it hit the first serious slope. In the long light of April, it was the color of something you couldn't name exactly, between gold and green, between winter and summer, between one thing and another. He had lived here for 15 years. He had stopped noticing it for most of 7 of them. He was noticing it now. There's nothing to go back to. The boy had said it, the way Elias had thought things for years, without flinching away from the weight of them, without dressing them in softer words. Just this is the fact of it, work with the fact. He had built this ranch with that logic. He had rebuilt himself with that logic, more or less, not fully, not cleanly, but enough to keep moving. You took what was true and you worked with it. What was true was there was a woman in town with 3 children, and 4 days until the next stage, and not much money. And she had done something dishonest, and also something that Elias, if he was being truthful with himself, understood the mechanics of. Not every lie is cowardice. Some are the last available option for a person who has run out of other options first. He did not ride back to town that evening. But Thursday morning was still 3 days away, and he was not a man who decided things in the evening when he was tired. He decided things in the clear light of early morning, with coffee when his mind was running on its actual rather than its residual fuel. 3 days. He got off the fence and walked back to the ranch in the cooling air, and the valley behind him went from gold to gray to dark, and the first stars came out above the north ridge, and Elias Croce went inside and made dinner for one in a house that had 17 rooms, most of which he no longer entered, and ate it standing at the window like he did every night, looking at nothing in particular. He was not thinking about 4 days. He was not thinking about Nora. He was not thinking about the boots in the back room. He was, in fact, thinking about all 3, consecutively and without mercy, until the food was gone and the light was gone. and there was nothing left to do but go to bed and wait for morning to arrive with whatever it was going to bring. Morning came to Harrow Bend the way it always did in April, cold first, then light, the two arriving in that order and with no particular kindness between them. Elias had been awake since before the cold lifted, which meant he had been awake since before 5, which meant he had not slept more than 4 hours, which was 2 fewer than he needed and 2 more than he expected. He made coffee. He stood at the window. The upper pasture was gray and still. He had made a decision. He had made it, in fact, somewhere around 3 in the morning, in the specific way that men who resist decisions for a long time finally arrive at them not with clarity or relief, but with the flat resignation of a man who has looked at every alternative and found them all worse. He had told himself it was practical. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself a great many things that he was not entirely certain he believed, and then he saddled his horse at 6:15 and rode into Harrow Bend before he could think his way back out of it. Vera was already sweeping in front of the feed store when he arrived. She looked at him and then at the hour and then at him again. Early, she said. Tell her she has 4 days, Elias said. If she wants to see what the ranch looks like before she decides about Thursday, I'll take her out this morning. The children come too. Vera held the broom without moving it. You changed your mind, I said she can look, Elias said. I didn't say anything else. Vera looked at him for a moment with the expression she reserved for men who were saying one thing and meaning another, and expecting not to be noticed. I'll tell her, she said. He waited by the horses. Evelyn came down 20 minutes later. She had the baby on her hip and Nora beside her and Caleb one step behind, which was where Caleb seemed to position himself in any situation that was new or uncertain, close enough to act, far enough to assess. She had changed her dress, or at least brushed and straightened the one she had, and her hair was pinned more firmly than it had been the day before. She looked rested, in the way that people who have not slept look rested when they have decided rested is the necessary presentation. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Elias. Vera said you wanted to show us the ranch, she said. I said you could see it, he said. If you wanted. There's a difference? Yes. She considered this. All right, she said. We'd like to see it. He had borrowed a second horse from the livery, an older mare, steady and wide-backed for Evelyn and the baby. Caleb rode up behind Elias without being asked and without asking, simply climbed up when Elias held still long enough, which Elias noted. Nora sat in front of Evelyn and narrated the landscape as it passed, which nobody asked her to do and nobody told her to stop. The ride north took 40 minutes. No one talked much. Elias did not offer commentary on what they passed, which was itself a kind of test. He wanted to see whether she would fill the silence with questions, with performance, with effort. She did not. She rode with the baby against her chest and watched the land with the focused attention of someone who was actually looking at it rather than at what it represented. When the ranch came into view, she said nothing for a moment. Then, how much of this is yours? To the north ridge, he said. East to the creek, west to the stand of cottonwoods. She looked at it. It's a lot of land for one man. Yes, he said. It's also a lot of fence. Yes. She nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected, and they rode the rest of the way the same quiet they had maintained since town. The house was not what she had imagined, though she could not have said precisely what she had imagined. It was larger than it needed to be for one man, and it was built to last, which was apparent in the construction of it, the way the corners sat square and the porch boards ran true. But it had the specific quality of a house that had not been inhabited fully in a long time. It was clean in the sense that there was no disorder. Elias was not a man who left things scattered, but it was not warm. There were no curtains. There were no rugs. The kitchen had what it needed, and nothing beyond what it needed, every surface cleared to its functional minimum. Evelyn walked through it while Elias stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her look at things and not touching them. Nora walked beside her mother and touched everything with one careful finger, which Elias observed and did not comment on. 7 years, Evelyn said. She was looking at the kitchen window, which faced east and would catch the morning light. What about it, he said. You said in your letter you'd been alone here 7 years. I did. She turned from the window. This kitchen could be very good, she said. It was neither a compliment nor a question. It was the assessment of someone who was looking at raw material and calculating what it would take to work with it. It functions, he said. It functions, she agreed. It could do more than that. Elias looked at her for a moment. You want to cook something? She met his eyes. I want to see if the stove draws right, and whether you have the supplies I'd need. You're not here to impress me, he said. I told you it's just a look. I know what you told me, Evelyn said. But I've been feeding 3 children on what Vera Kettrick has in her spare pantry for 2 days, and I have a baby who's going to need something warm in the next hour. So this isn't about impressing you. It's practical. He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved away from the doorway. Pantry's through there, he said. Take what you need. She took what she needed. He went outside. He sat on the porch steps with his back to the door and listened to the sound of the kitchen coming alive, the scrape of the iron pot, the knock of the flue handle, the particular clatter of a person who knew their way around a fire without needing to think about it. Caleb appeared around the side of the barn with a question about the horses, which Elias answered, and then Caleb stayed, which Elias had not exactly invited, but did not refuse. The boy sat on the lower step and watched the corral. "How many horses?" Caleb said. "3 working horses." "2 I'm breaking. You break them yourself." "Who else?" Elias said. Caleb thought about this. "My father had a horse once, before we moved to town, a gray one. He was bad at riding it." "Most people are," Elias said. "He fell off 3 times in 1 week," Caleb said. There was no grief in it exactly. It was more like taking something out of a box and looking at it in the light, something he had looked at before. He laughed every time. He was like that. Elias looked at the corral. "Good quality," he said, laughing. Caleb nodded. "I don't do it enough." "No," Elias said. "Neither do I." They sat in something that was almost comfortable, which was strange for 2 people who had met 2 days ago under circumstances that had not been comfortable at all. But there it was. From inside came the smell of something cooking. It moved through the door and across the porch and out into the morning air, and it was the smell of onions and salt pork and something warm. And it was the first time in 7 years that smell had come from inside that house. And Elias sat on the porch step and did not let himself think about what that meant. They ate at the kitchen table. All of them, Elias at one end, Evelyn at the other. Caleb and Nora on the bench along one side rose in a makeshift arrangement of Evelyn's folded coat on the bench beside Nora. It was not elegant. The food was simple. Nothing that hadn't been in the pantry already, nothing that required more than 40 minutes and competent hands. But it was hot, and it tasted like food rather than like sustenance, which is a distinction that matters more than most people acknowledge until they have gone long enough without it. Elias ate without comment. Nora ate with enthusiasm and asked, partway through, whether the ranch had any cats, because she believed in cats. "There's one in the barn," Elias said, gray, no name. Nora looked at him with an expression of patient correction. "It has a name now." "What's its name?" Elias said, and he did not sound like a man who was engaging with a child to be polite. He sounded like a man who had asked a question because he wanted the answer. "Margaret," Nora said. "That's a large name for a barn cat." "She looked like a Margaret," Nora said, and returned to her food with the air of someone who has settled a matter. Evelyn watched this exchange from her end of the table. She watched Elias's face while it happened, not the words, but the thing beneath the words. The way a question asked by a 6-year-old had briefly made his face less defended than it had been at any point in the 2 days she had known him. She filed this away, without making any decision about what to do with it. After the meal, while Evelyn cleaned the kitchen, which she did efficiently, and without waiting to be asked, Caleb to the barn and Nora went with him, presumably to find Margaret and inform her of her new name. Elias stood in the kitchen doorway watching Evelyn work and said nothing for a while. "Then you cook like someone who's cooked for a lot of people." "I ran a boarding house," she said, "for 14 months, after Thomas died and before we used up the last of what we'd saved." "Boarding house in Fayetteville." Yes, she was scrubbing the pot. Her hands moved without wasted motion, 6 boarders at peak. "I learned to make $1 of food feed 8 people and still have them feel like they'd had a meal." And after the boarding house, she didn't stop scrubbing. After the boarding house, there was a family in Benton who needed a housekeeper for 4 months, and then a laundry in Little Rock for 6 weeks. And then she stopped. Started again, and then I found the agency. "'Cause you ran out of options." She looked up at him, not angry, just looking. "Your boy's told you." "He's not my boy." A pause. "He told you," she said again. "He told me there was nothing to go back to," Elias said. "He wasn't asking for anything. He just wanted me to know." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She turned back to the pot. "He's 9 years old and he worries too much for 9, she said. "He's been worrying since he was 7. I wish he wouldn't, but I also," she stopped. "I also needed him to, for a while, and that's not something I'm proud of." Elias said nothing. He had the quality rare in men, rare in anyone, of being able to hold silence without filling it, which meant that people sometimes said more than they intended to, because the silence was there and they trusted it without necessarily deciding to. "I didn't tell you about the children because I knew you'd say no," she said. "And that's dishonest. I know it's dishonest. I'm telling you I did it on purpose and I knew what I was doing and I thought I could." She set down the pot, dried her hands on the cloth that had been hanging on the hook by the window, the same hook where Elias kept it, the same cloth. "I thought I could manage the rest once I got here. I've been managing things for 2 years. I thought I could manage one more." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Nora's voice rose briefly from the direction of the barn, some declaration about Margaret, and then was gone. "You're not going back Thursday," Elias said. Evelyn turned around. She looked at him carefully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're not going back Thursday," he said. You'll stay. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes, she repeated. I'm not making promises. He said, I'm saying stay. Work the house. The children stay with you. We'll see how it goes. She looked at him for a long moment. He was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, and his face was doing the thing it apparently always did, unreadable on the surface. Something working underneath that he was choosing, carefully and with some effort, not to show. She had known him 2 days. She did not know him. But she knew this kind of careful effort. All right, she said. All right, he said, and went outside. They moved in that afternoon. There was not much to move: the trunk, Evelyn's bag, a canvas satchel that held the children's things. Elias carried the trunk up the porch steps without being asked and set it in the room at the end of the east hallway, which was the largest of the available rooms, and which he had aired out that morning before they arrived, a fact he did not mention. Nora immediately identified the room as satisfactory and began a thorough inspection that included opening every drawer of the bureau and reporting on its contents. The contents were nothing, the drawers were empty, but Nora reported on them with the same thoroughness she applied to everything. Elias showed Caleb the barn. He did this without preamble, simply said, "Come on," when the trunk was set down, and walked toward the barn, and Caleb followed. He showed him where the tools were kept, the order they were kept in, the way the feed was organized. Caleb listened without interrupting, which was correct, and asked 2 questions at the end, both of which were good questions. Where did the water come from for the corral troughs in winter, and what happened to the horses during a hard freeze? Elias answered both questions at full length because they deserved it. "You can help in the mornings if you want," Elias said. "Before school." "There's a school," Caleb said. "Harrow Bend has a schoolhouse. Teacher's name is Mrs. Aldrich. She's strict and fair, which is the correct combination." Caleb looked at the horses in the corral. "I haven't been in school for 8 months. Then you've got some catching up to do," Elias said, not unkindly, just as a fact. Caleb nodded. "I know." "Starting Monday," Elias said, and walked back toward the house. The first week passed with the specific texture of 2 cautious things learning each other's weight. Evelyn woke before anyone, which was already her habit, and had the kitchen going by the time Elias came down, which was at 5:30, no exceptions. The first morning he came into the kitchen and found it warm and smelling of coffee. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the way a man stands when something is different from what he expected and he is recalibrating. He said nothing. He poured coffee and sat at the table and read the 3-day-old newspaper that came with the mail. And Evelyn moved around the kitchen in the morning quiet, and they did not speak much, and the not speaking was not uncomfortable. This surprised her. She had expected it to be uncomfortable. She was not comfortable in general. She was in a strange house with a man she did not know, sleeping in a room that still smelled faintly of disuse, stretching Elias's pantry supplies into meals while trying to calculate what could be planted in the kitchen garden if the soil was workable, watching her children find their footing in a new place while also finding her own. She was managing 6 things at once, which was familiar, but managing them in front of a stranger, which was not. She was tired in a way that went down to the bone and had been there for 2 years. But the mornings, the quiet kitchen, the coffee, those were not uncomfortable. She found, over the first few days, that Elias had a system for everything, and the systems were good ones. The house ran on logic rather than habit. Things were where they were, because that was the most efficient place for them, not because they had always been there. She recognized this kind of thinking. She had done a version of it herself in the boarding house, mapping out the flow of 14 daily tasks against the hours available to do them, cutting the waste. They thought about space and time in the same underlying way, which she had not expected. She did not tell him this. It would have been too much. She reorganized the pantry on the 3rd day, which she did carefully and with full expectation that it might be unwelcome. She was not rearranging for the sake of it. She moved the grain stores to the lower shelf because they were heavy and she needed them accessible. And she put the medicinal supplies on the eye-level shelf rather than the top, because with a baby in the house, that was the correct order of priority. Elias came, looked at it, and said nothing except, "Where'd the molasses go?" "Second shelf left side," she said. He checked. It was there. He nodded once and went out. This was, she understood, as close to approval as he was currently offering, and she was fine with that. The children settled in their own ways, which were as different from each other as the children themselves. Nora settled fastest, because Nora had a talent for deciding that a situation was acceptable and then proceeding to inhabit it without further negotiation. She found Margaret the barn cat on the 2nd day and spent an hour establishing a relationship that Margaret seemed ambivalent about but tolerant of. She helped Evelyn in the kitchen with the focused enthusiasm of a child who genuinely likes participating in things rather than just appearing to. She talked to Elias when he was present, not constantly but regularly, with the ease of someone who had not yet learned to read the signals that said a person does not want to be talked to. Elias, for his part, answered her. Not always at length, but he answered. On the fourth day, Nora informed him at breakfast that Margaret had allowed herself to be held for 30 seconds, which was an improvement, and that she thought Margaret was lonely. She's a barn cat, Elias said. That doesn't mean she's not lonely, Nora said. Lonely doesn't care where you live. Elias looked at her over his coffee cup. Something in his face did the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency, since these people had come into his house, shifting, adjusting, moving towards something it had been moving away from for a long time. No, he said finally. I suppose it doesn't. Rose was too young to settle or not settle in any conscious sense. She was present, she was demanding in the uncomplicated way of babies. She cried at night, and was walked and cried again and was walked again, and through all of this she also smiled at anyone who held still long enough to look at her, which was the particular gift of babies who have not yet learned that the world is sometimes worth being cautious about. Elias did not hold her. He watched her sometimes, from across the room, the way a man watches something that is not quite familiar to him, trying to place it in a category he understands. Rose, for her part, watched him back with the frank interest that babies extend to large, quiet, immovable things. Caleb went to school on Monday. He came back quieter than he'd left, which Evelyn noticed and did not press, because she knew her son. She asked once at dinner how it had gone. He said, fine. She asked if the teacher was like Elias had described. He said, mostly. And that was the end of it, and she let it be the end of it. What she did not know until Elias told her, 2 days later with the casualness of mentioning a weather observation, was that he had ridden past the schoolhouse at noon on Monday and seen Caleb sitting alone outside during the midday break, while the other boys played on the far side of the yard. He mentioned this without editorializing. Evelyn said, did he see you? Elias said. Good, she said. And then, after a moment, thank you for telling me. He nodded and went out. It was in the second week that the town started talking. This was not surprising. The town had been talking since the morning Evelyn stepped off the stage, but it changed in character as the days passed. At first, it had been the ordinary gossip of a small community processing new information. Who was she? Where had she come from? What was Elias thinking? Then, when it became clear that she was staying, the gossip developed a harder edge. Evelyn became aware of it at Mercer's, on the Wednesday of the second week, when she went in for flour and coffee, and the conversation in the store stopped in the way. Conversations stop when the person being discussed has entered. She had been in enough situations like this to know what it meant. She bought her flour and her coffee and said good morning to the two women who had stopped talking and did not wait for them to say it back. Outside, she stood for a moment in the spring air. The street was ordinary and unhurried. Down the block, Adelaide Foss was coming out of the dry goods store with a basket, and when she saw Evelyn, she turned and went back inside, which was not subtle but was at least efficient. Evelyn walked back to the wagon. She had expected this. She had not expected it to feel as bad as it did, which was its own kind of naivety. She had thought that knowing a thing was coming would blunt it, and it did not entirely, which was a fact about hurt that she kept having to relearn. She did not tell Elias. She did not need to. He already knew how Harrow Bend operated. She had not come this far to need protecting from people's mouths. What she had not anticipated was Nora. Nora came home from an afternoon at Vera Kettrick's. Vera had developed an immediate and uncomplicated fondness for Nora, which Nora returned with equal uncomplications and said at dinner, with the directness that was her fundamental mode of communication, Mrs. Foss told her daughter that Mama is living in sin. The table went quiet. Evelyn said, carefully, where did you hear that, sweetheart? Outside Vera's, Mrs. Foss was talking to the woman with the hat. She said it out loud. Nora paused. What's living in sin? Caleb was looking at his plate. Elias set down his fork. It means Evelyn began and stopped because there was no version of the explanation that was appropriate for 6-year-old ears and also true. It means Elias said that some people don't understand a situation and make up a reason for it that suits what they already think. He picked up his fork again. It doesn't mean they're right. Nora considered this. So they're wrong. Yes, Elias said. Should someone tell them? Sometimes telling people doesn't help, Elias said. Sometimes you just have to be what you are long enough that they can't argue with it anymore. Nora thought about this with the seriousness she applied to important information. Then she went back to eating. Caleb looked up from his plate and looked at Elias for a moment. Elias did not look back. He was eating. But something in the set of his jaw had changed, tightened, which on Elias's face meant something was working behind it that he was choosing not to show. After the children were in bed, Evelyn found him on the porch. She came out and stood at the railing, not next to him, but near enough, and they looked at the dark pasture together for a while without speaking. I'll handle it, she said finally. I know you will, he said. That's not what I'm thinking about. What are you thinking about? He was quiet for a moment. I'm thinking that they've been talking about me for 7 years, and I never cared what they said. But they've been talking about you for 2 weeks, and I find I care a great deal more than I expected to." Evelyn was still. She was careful with her face in the way that she had learned to be careful with a flame in a wind, not to cup it too visibly, not to call attention to what needed protecting. "Don't do anything," she said. "I'm not going to do anything." "I mean it, Elias. I've handled worse than Adelaide Foss." "I know," he said. "I believe you." A pause. "That doesn't make it right." She looked at the side of his face in the dark. He was looking at the pasture. He was, she thought, a deeply stubborn man who was also, beneath a very substantial amount of defensive construction, a man who believed in fairness at a foundational level, not as a principle he had chosen, but as something structural, something built into how he read a situation. "Thank you," she said, "for what you told Nora." "It's true," he said. "I know, but you said it instead of leaving me to." He said nothing. She went inside and he stayed on the porch, and she did not know how long he stayed there because she was asleep for the first time in weeks before she expected to be. It was Rose who broke through first, and it happened without warning, which was how things with Elias seemed to happen without announcement, without transition, simply a shift from one state to another that you only understood in retrospect. It was the 3rd week. Evelyn had put Rose down in the bedroom and come back to the kitchen to finish the evening bread, and Rose, who was 9 months old and in the grips of a tooth that was taking its time arriving, had woken up 20 minutes later and begun crying with the particular persistence of a baby who has decided that the night is unacceptable and requires changing. Evelyn's hands were in dough. She called out that she'd be right there and pulled her hands free and was wiping them on the cloth when she heard the crying stop. She stood still. The kitchen was quiet. From the back of the house came no sound. She walked to the hallway and looked in through the bedroom door. Elias was standing beside the small makeshift cot, the blanket-padded drawer that Evelyn had rigged in the first days, before Elias had spent a silent evening in the barn and produced, without comment, a serviceable wooden cradle that had clearly been made a long time ago, and not used for a long time, and he had Rose against his shoulder. His hand covered most of her back. He was not rocking, not pacing, just standing, his hand moving in a slow circle. Rose had her fist in his collar and her face turned into his neck, and her eyes were closing with the boneless trust of a baby who has decided the person holding her is sufficient. Elias did not know Evelyn was there. His face, in the low light, was not the face he wore in company. It was quieter, more open. Something in it had come loose from its usual position, and he had not had time to put it back. He looked like a man holding something he thought he had lost. Evelyn went back to the kitchen and put her hands back in the dough and worked in silence, and did not tell him what she had seen, and was careful not to cry, not because crying was wrong, but because this was his, and she would not take it from him by witnessing it in the wrong way. That night, after the house was fully quiet, Elias went to the back bedroom. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame and looked at the wooden horse on the floor and the small boots by the window. He stood there for what was probably a long time. He did not go in. He pulled the door gently shut and went to his room. And for the first time in 7 Aprils, he lay down on his bed and felt something other than the specific weight of a man who has walled off one whole portion of himself and called it grief management. He felt the walls doing what walls do when something is alive on both sides of them. He did not sleep for a while, but when he did sleep, he slept. The morning of the 16th day was when Evelyn came outside and found him at the kitchen garden with a shovel. He had turned half the beds already. The soil was dark and workable, good soil, better than she had expected, deep and without the clay resistance of the Arkansas ground she was used to. He was working the far bed when she came out with her coffee, and he glanced up and then went back to the shovel. "It'll need compost," she said, "bins at the south end of the barn." She walked the beds looking at what was there, what had been there. The ghost of a previous garden was visible in the organization of the beds someone had planted here once, and planted well, with the thoughtfulness of someone who intended to tend it over seasons. She did not ask who. She came back to where he was working and stood at the edge of the bed. "I was thinking pole beans along this wall," she said, "and squash on the south end where it gets the afternoon light. If I can get seeds from Mercer's this week, we'll have time." He kept working. "There might be seeds in the barn," he said. "Storage shelf back left. I don't know if they're still good. I'll check." "Potato sets from the Hollis farm are better than Mercer's," he said. "I can bring some next time I ride out." She looked at him. He was looking at the soil, Elias. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. For this she meant the garden. She also meant all of it, the room, the cradle, the conversation at dinner with Nora, the porch in the dark, and Rose against his shoulder in the low light of the back bedroom. Even though she was not supposed to know about that, he looked at her for a moment. His face did its thing, the shift, the adjustment, and then he said simply, "You're making this house work." "We're making it work," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once. the same nod she had begun to read as Elias Crow's most honest form of agreement, and went back to the soil. Behind them, from inside the house, came Nora's voice informing Caleb that Margaret had followed her from the barn to the porch, which meant Margaret wanted to be an indoor cat, and Kolb responding with the patience of a 9-year-old who has had this conversation before. And Rose made a sound that was not quite a word yet, but was pointing in that direction, reaching for something in the morning light. Elias heard all of it without looking up from the soil, and did not smile exactly. But something in his shoulders settled. Something that had been held up for a long time let a little of its weight go, and rested. The pole beans went in on a Friday, which meant Evelyn had been at the ranch for exactly 3 weeks and 2 days, and had stopped counting after the first week, because counting had started to feel like waiting, and she had decided she was not waiting anymore. She was staying. She had not said this out loud to anyone, including herself, with full deliberateness. It had simply become true the way some things become true gradually, and then completely the way soil warms through spring until one morning you put your hand on it and it's ready. She had stopped performing adequacy and started working towards something, which was a different posture entirely. The garden was part of it. The reorganized pantry was part of it. The twice-mended curtain she had hung in the kitchen window, made from a length of fabric she found in the bottom of the linen trunk that had clearly not been opened in years, was part of it. Elias had not said anything about the curtain, but she had come in from the garden one afternoon and found him sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, and he was looking at the window, with the light coming through the fabric in the late afternoon way it did. And whatever he was thinking, he did not say. She did not ask. Some things, she had learned, were better allowed to be whatever they were before words got near them. Hattie Boone was 73 years old and lived alone at the east end of Harrow Bend, in a house that had once been adequate and had, over the years, become a record of all the maintenance that had not been done. She had a daughter in Billings who sent money twice a year and intended to visit, and had not visited in 4 years. She had neighbors who were civil to her at church, and otherwise mostly left her to her own arrangements, which was the fate of elderly women in small towns who had outlived their usefulness as social connectors and were now simply present, like old furniture acknowledged, occasionally referenced, largely left alone. Evelyn had met Hattie once, briefly, at Mercer's in the first week. Hattie had been the only person in the store who had not stopped talking when Evelyn walked in. She had been in the middle of a complaint about the quality of recent salt pork, and she had finished the complaint and then looked at Evelyn with the frank, evaluating look of a woman who had been forming opinions for 7 decades and had no reason to be coy about it. "You're the one Elias sent for," she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He's difficult," Hattie said. "Not bad, difficult. Most people here don't bother with the distinction." "So I've been told," Evelyn said. Hattie had nodded once, as though Evelyn had passed some preliminary test whose criteria had not been specified, and returned to her salt pork complaint with the clerk, who appeared to have been waiting patiently for this to happen. That was the extent of their acquaintance. Evelyn had thought about Hattie once or twice afterward, the sharpness of her, the lack of apology, and filed her away in the category of people worth knowing more of when time allowed. Time did not immediately allow. It was Vera who told her, on a Wednesday afternoon in early May, that Hattie had not been seen in 3 days. Vera said it in the way that small-town people sometimes report concerning news, not with alarm, because alarm requires admitting that you should have checked sooner, but with a careful neutrality that allows the hearer to do the alarming. She mentioned it while they were at the pump. She said it the same way she mentioned the weather. "Someone ought to check on her," Vera said. "Someone ought to," Evelyn agreed, and there was a pause. And in that pause, both of them understood that the someone in question was going to be Evelyn, because Vera had a husband with a bad back and a store to run, and the other women of Harrow Bend had established, over the years, a collective relationship with Hattie that was courteous but not close. And not close was, in Evelyn's experience, a category that reliably produced no action in a crisis. She went that afternoon. She left Rose with Caleb, who had started coming home from school with marginally less of that careful quiet in his face, who had yesterday come home with a question about astronomy that Mrs. Aldrich had apparently introduced and that he had been thinking about since, and walked the 4 blocks to Hattie's house at the east end of town with Nora beside her, because separating Nora from any situation required more effort than it was usually worth. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again and called Hattie's name, and from inside came a sound, not a word, but a sound, and that was enough. The door was unlocked. She went in. Hattie was in the back bedroom, in bed, with the particular gray look of a person whose body has been fighting something without help for several days. The room was close and warm, in the wrong way stale, not heated. The water pitcher on the bedside table was empty. The window was shut tight. Hattie opened her eyes when Evelyn came in and said, with a voice that had gone rough and thin, "I told myself someone would come." "Someone came," Evelyn said, and sat on the edge of the bed and put her hand on Hattie's forehead without preamble. The way you do when you have nursed people before, and the social awkwardness of touching a near stranger is less important than finding out what you are dealing with. What she was dealing with was a fever that had been running for several days, and a chest that sounded, when Hattie coughed, like something that needed attention. Not mortal, Evelyn had heard Thomas's chest in those last weeks, but serious in the way things become serious when they are left alone too long. "Has anyone been in?" Evelyn asked. "Mrs. Aldrich sent her boy with bread 2 days ago," Hattie said. He left it on the step. Evelyn did not say what she thought about this. She opened the window to let the stale air out, and she sent Nora back to Vera's for broth, if there was any, and fresh water and 2 more blankets, which Nora undertook with the seriousness she applied to any mission of substance. She spent the rest of the afternoon with Hattie. She got water into her, and then broth when Nora returned with it, and she talked to her, which was not something Hattie required. Hattie was not a woman who needed to be soothed, but which Hattie apparently did not mind, because she answered when Evelyn spoke, and occasionally elaborated on her answers with observations that were sharp and dry and worth hearing. She told Evelyn about Harrow Bend by way of being useful, not the gossip version, not whose husband had done what to whom, but the structural version, the geography of it, who held real influence and who held apparent influence, and why the two were not the same, which families had been here long enough to consider the town a personal possession, and which of those families were not as solid as they appeared from the outside. Adelaide Foss, Hattie said, around the 3rd hour, when the broth had brought some of her voice back, has been afraid of something for 30 years. Afraid women make the worst enemies because they dress it up as morality. "What is she afraid of?" Evelyn said. "That someone will do what she never did," Hattie said. "Go after something she wanted and actually get it." Evelyn looked at her. "She wanted Elias Crow about 12 years back," Hattie said. "Before he married Constance, he was not interested. She has not entirely forgiven him, or anyone who reminds her of the fact." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That's a long time to carry something like that." "Small towns have long memories and short entertainments," Hattie said. "It's a bad combination." She closed her eyes. "Stay until I sleep." Evelyn stayed. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. She brought food and made sure the water pitcher was full, and opened the window when the air was good, and closed it when the wind came up. She did not make a declaration about it. She simply went. Elias knew. She had told him the first night, matter-of-factly, that Hattie Boone was sick and she was going to help. He had not said she shouldn't. He had not said much at all. He had, the next day, without telling her he was going to, arranged for the Mercer boy to carry wood to Hattie's house, which meant Hattie's stove stayed fed, which was not a small thing. Evelyn noticed. She did not say so. She was learning the language. The town noticed too, though the town's noticing took a different shape. Harrow Bend was a place that had opinions about what women did with their time, and a widow living in Elias Crow's house was already providing more than enough material. The sight of the same woman walking daily to the east end of town to nurse an old woman who had no particular claim on her loyalty was the kind of thing that a certain type of person found irritating because it did not fit neatly into the narrative they had already constructed. Adelaide Foss, to her credit, or perhaps her consistency, was not one of those people who went quiet when the evidence moved against them. She was the kind of person who moved the theory to accommodate the evidence, rather than the other way around. On the 6th day of Evelyn's visits, Adelaide was standing outside the dry goods store when Evelyn passed, and she said to the woman beside her, and not specifically to Evelyn, but loudly enough, you'd think she was angling for a mention in the old woman's will. Evelyn did not stop walking. She heard it with the same part of her that heard everything in a peripheral way, filed, noted, set aside. She had stopped expecting Adelaide Foss to be a fair person. Expecting unfair people to be fair was a waste of capacity she needed elsewhere. But it was Caleb who heard it. He had been walking home from school 2 blocks back, and he had caught up to Evelyn just in time for it. And she saw us in his face when she glanced at him, that he had heard and had understood, and was doing the very adult thing of deciding what to do with it. His jaw had tightened in the way that Evelyn recognized, the way Thomas's had when he was angry, and trying not to show it for her benefit. "Don't," she said quietly. "I wasn't going to do anything," Caleb said. "You were thinking about it." A pause. "She's not right," he said. "No," Evelyn said, "she isn't. So why do we just—" "Because there are 100 ways to fight a thing, and most of them make it worse," Evelyn said. "And the one way that works takes longer." "What way is that?" "You just keep doing what you're doing, and you don't let them make it about them." Caleb walked beside her in silence for half a block. "That's hard," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said, "it is." He thought about this. "Is that why you keep going back to Hattie's?" I go back because Hattie is sick and someone should, Evelyn said. But yes, it's also that. Caleb nodded slowly with the nod of a 9-year-old who is absorbing a principle rather than just a fact. They walked the rest of the way home without talking, and that evening at dinner he was quieter than usual. But it was a different kind of quiet, less defended, more considering, the quiet of someone working something out. On the 9th day, Hattie's fever broke. Evelyn arrived at 7 in the morning and found Hattie sitting up in bed for the first time, with her hair uncharacteristically loose and an expression of determined clarity on her face that suggested the fever's departure had been taken as a personal victory. I need tea, Hattie said by way of greeting. Good morning to you too, Evelyn said and went to make it. She made tea and brought it and sat in the chair by the bed, and Hattie drank it and said, You've been coming every day. Yes, why? Evelyn considered the question seriously because Hattie was a person who deserved serious consideration. Because no one else was, she said, and because you were worth coming to. Hattie looked at her over the rim of the cup. Her eyes, even after 9 days of fever, were absolutely sharp. You didn't know me well enough to know that. I knew enough, Evelyn said. You were the only person in Mercer's who didn't stop talking when I walked in. Hattie almost smiled. It was a brief thing and quickly controlled, but it was there. That's a low bar, she said. In my experience, Evelyn said, low bars tell you more than high ones. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, Harrow Bend was doing its morning things, a wagon going past. Someone calling across the street. The ordinary sounds of a town waking up. Adelaide Foss said something about you at the pump yesterday, Hattie said. I imagine she did, Evelyn said. She said you were trouble disguised as virtue. Hattie put down her cup. I told her that trouble disguised as virtue was still virtue, and that she ought to try it sometime. Evelyn looked at her. You didn't need to do that. I know I didn't need to, Hattie said. I wanted to. She paused. I've been watching this town perform itself for 40 years. I'm too old to pretend I don't know what I'm seeing. She looked at Evelyn steadily. You're good for him. Evelyn was still. I knew Constance, Hattie said. I knew what Elias was before and what he became after. I'd given up on anything changing. You came, and in 3 weeks the man bought seed potatoes and is planting things in the ground again. She let this sit. He never planted after Constance, not once. Evelyn did not say anything for a moment. She looked at her hands. I don't know what we are, she said honestly. I don't know what he thinks we are. What do you think, Hattie said. I think he's a man who got hurt badly enough that he built a whole life around not getting hurt again, Evelyn said. And I think he's recently noticed that the life he built is not exactly a life. And you? Evelyn looked up. And I am not going to push on something before it's ready to move, she said. I know what it feels like to lose a person. I would not rush that for anything. Hattie was quiet. Then she said, You're wiser than you look. That's not necessarily a compliment, Evelyn said. It's meant as one, Hattie said, and picked up her tea again. 2 weeks after the fever broke, Hattie Boone walked into church. This was not in itself remarkable. Hattie attended church reliably, had done so for decades. What was remarkable was that she walked in after the service had started, which she never did, and she walked directly to the front of the room and turned and faced the congregation before the preacher had the presence of mind to object. Evelyn was not there. She did not attend the Harrow Bend church, for reasons that had become self-evident in the first week. She heard about what happened from Vera that same afternoon, delivered in the specific tone Vera used for things she considered significant. Hattie had stood in front of the congregation for approximately 3 minutes. She had said she had been ill for 9 days. She had said the woman Elias Crow had brought to this town had come to her house every day. For those 9 days had cooked for her and sat with her and brought her through it. She had said not one person from this congregation had done the same. She had said she was not interested in the reasons. Then she had said, with the full weight of 40 years of having watched this town perform itself, Evelyn Hart is a decent woman doing decent work, and every one of you who has spoken otherwise should make your peace with the difference between what is true and what is comfortable to believe. She had sat down. The preacher had cleared his throat and continued with the service. Vera reported all of this with the controlled satisfaction of a person who had been waiting for some version of it to happen. She said. Adelaide Foss's face went a color I have never seen on a living person. I was genuinely concerned. Evelyn listened to all of it and said, she shouldn't have had to do that. No, Vera agreed. But she wanted to, and frankly, someone needed to. Evelyn looked at the feed store wall across the room. She thought about Hattie sitting up in bed demanding tea, and the small, controlled, almost smile over the rim of the cup. She's a formidable woman, she said. She's a force of nature, Vera said. Always has been. People here just forgot because she got old. She paused. They'll stop talking now. Or at least talk quieter. Evelyn was not sure about that. Some people did not stop talking because they were wrong. They only stopped because the thing they were talking about had moved out of range. She did not say this to Vera because Vera was happy and it was a nice afternoon, and Evelyn did not need to be the one who complicated everything. It happened on a Tuesday morning, 22 days after Hattie's church appearance. The kitchen garden had been producing in a modest early-season way lettuces, a few radishes, the first tentative suggestions of the beans along the south wall. Evelyn was out at the garden before breakfast, which was a habit she had developed. 15 minutes in the cool morning with the plants before the day began, and required everything from her. It was the quietest part of the day, and she had learned to protect it. Inside, she could hear the household waking up in its various degrees, Rose's first sound of the day, Caleb's deliberate footsteps, the particular rapid movement that meant Nora had woken with full energy rather than arriving at it gradually, which was Nora's usual mode. She heard Nora go downstairs. She heard the kitchen sounds, Elias already up, already with his coffee, as always. She was not close enough to the window to hear the conversation, only the register of it, Nora's bright and quick, Elias's low and unhurried. This exchange happened every morning now. It had become part of the texture of the place. She was pulling a weed from between two bean plants when she heard it. Not words, just the silence that followed words. The kind of silence that has a shape. She waited. After a moment she heard Nora's voice again, in the normal key of Nora, continuing whatever she had been saying before the silence, and then Elias's voice, a little rougher than his usual morning tone but present, and then the ordinary sounds of breakfast resuming. Evelyn pulled 2 more weeds. She looked at the beans. The bean plants looked back at her with the ignorant placidity of bean plants, which she found at this moment deeply useful. She went inside. The kitchen was the same as it always was at breakfast. Elias at the table, Nora beside him with her cup of warm water and honey, the bread on the board, Rose in her cradle, making the sounds of someone who had decided to be a morning person. Caleb was on the stairs. Elias looked at Evelyn when she came in. His face was composed. It was always composed. But there was something in his eyes that was different this morning, not raw exactly, but closer to the surface than usual. Something had been moved, and he was sitting with where it had moved to. She did not ask. She poured her coffee. She checked on Rose. She sliced bread and set it on the table and sat down. And the meal began the way it always did. And nobody said anything about the silence that had happened. And nobody needed to. It was Nora who told her later, while they were washing the breakfast things. She said it casually, in the same voice she used for all information equally weighted. I called him Papa this morning. Evelyn's hands went still in the wash water. By accident? She asked carefully. Nora thought about this with genuine consideration. I don't know, she said. I was talking about the cat, and then I just said it. It came out. She paused. He got very quiet. Did he say anything? Not right away. Nora dried a plate with the focused inefficiency of a 6-year-old. Then he said good morning. But his voice was different. Different how? Nora put down the plate and looked up at her mother with the specific expression she wore when she was trying to translate something internal into external language, which she was better at than most adults. Like when something hurts, but you're trying not to hold it where people can see. Evelyn looked at her daughter, 6 years old and already the most accurate person in a room. She reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from Nora's face and said, Okay, sweetheart. Did I do something wrong, Nora said. No, Evelyn said. You didn't do anything wrong. He didn't seem angry. Just Nora picked up the plate again. Quiet. He'll be okay, Evelyn said. She did not know if this was true. She believed it, which was close enough to know. Elias did not come in for the midday meal. This was not unusual. There were days when the work kept him out until late afternoon, and she always kept something warm. But she watched when she carried water to the garden, and she saw him at the far fence line, not working the fence but standing beside it, looking at nothing in particular for a long time. She let him alone. That was the right thing. She knew it was the right thing. She went back inside and helped Nora with the letters she was working on. Nora had recently developed an ambition to write a letter to Vera Ketrick and required assistance with spelling and fed Rose and checked Caleb's arithmetic and did the mending that had accumulated on the chair by the window, the ordinary afternoon work of a house that had people in it. Around 4 o'clock she heard him come in. She was in the main room. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She did not look up from the mending immediately, not because she was avoiding him, but because she was giving him a moment to choose how to enter this without the pressure of her attention. When she did look up, he was sitting at the table. She set down the mending and came into the kitchen. She poured 2 cups of coffee, without asking, and set one in front of him and sat down across the table. She did not open any conversational door. She simply sat. He had his hands around the cup. He looked at them for a while. His name was Samuel, he said. She was absolutely still. He was 4 years old, Elias said. When the fever came, his voice was even. It was the voice of a man reading aloud from something he has read many times before. So many times that the emotional content has worn smooth on the surface, but underneath the surface it is still there, fully intact, waiting. Constance lasted another 6 months. The fever came back in September. He stopped. I'd have taken it myself 100 times. That's not. He stopped again. That's not a useful thing to say. But it's what's true. Evelyn did not say she was sorry. She had learned, from her own grief, that sorry was the word people used when they didn't know what else to say, and she knew what to say, which was nothing, which was to sit across the table from a man who had been carrying something alone for 7 years, and let him know that the carrying did not have to be done in an empty room. Nor he started and stopped. She didn't know, Evelyn said quietly. I know she didn't know. He looked up. His eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible. Barely, if you knew where to look. She said it the way a child says a thing that's natural to her. Because it's natural to her. He looked back at his hands. I didn't expect that, no, Evelyn said, I know. I built this place to. He stopped. Started again differently. After I thought if I just kept the walls right, if I just kept working, eventually it would. He stopped again. Eventually it would be enough, Evelyn said. He looked at her. Something in his face cracked slightly, in the way stone cracks along a line that was always there. Yes, he said, was it? A long pause.
No, he said.
Not once. The kitchen was quiet. The afternoon light came through the fabric curtain and moved slowly across the table between them. And outside, Nora's voice carried from the barn she was, apparently, explaining something to Margaret again, and Rose made a small emphatic sound from the next room. I'm not going to tell you what to do with any of it, Evelyn said. I know what it is to lose something that size. I know it doesn't move on a schedule, and it doesn't respond to logic, and it doesn't care what you decide. She looked at him. But I will tell you that it doesn't get bigger when you let someone else know it's there. I thought it would. It doesn't. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank and set it down. His hands stopped gripping it, just held it. I know she's not trying to replace anything, he said. Nora, she's just Nora, Evelyn said. She doesn't replace. She just loves things. She loves things and she says so. It's all she knows how to do. Something moved across his face that was different from anything she had seen there before. It was not grief, exactly. And it was not relief, exactly. It was something that did not have a clean name, something like the feeling of a door that has been shut for a very long time being opened just slightly, not thrown open, not swept aside, just moved enough to let light through. He did not say anything else for a while. She did not say anything either. The coffee went cool in the cups. Caleb came home from school with a question about whether the earth really moved around the sun or whether that was a theory. And Elias answered him, yes, it moves. It's not theory. Here is how we know. And the answer took 10 minutes and covered more ground than Caleb had expected. And Caleb listened with the focused attention he gave to things that expanded the boundaries of what he understood was possible. And Nora came in from the barn with Margaret held at arm's length, informing everyone that Margaret had changed her mind about the outdoors, and could she stay in the kitchen. She's a barn cat, Elias said. You said that before, Nora said. And I said that didn't mean she wasn't lonely. She looked at him steadily. Have you changed your mind? Elias looked at Nora. At her serious face and her crooked coat buttons, and her complete confidence in the correctness of her own position. She sleeps in the barn, he said. During the day she can come to the porch. Nora considered this compromise. That's fair, she said, with the grace of a negotiator who knows when to take the win. She set Margaret down on the kitchen floor. Margaret looked around the kitchen with the expression of a cat who is trying to decide whether this new territory is worth the effort, and then walked directly to the warmest spot in the room, which happened to be the rug in front of the stove, and lay down. Elias watched this. Then he looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. And there in the kitchen, with the curtain moving in the evening draft, and Rose talking to the ceiling in her cradle, and Caleb at the table with his astronomy questions, and Nora informing Margaret of the new arrangement, something shifted in Elias Crow's face that had never shifted there before. Not joy, not yet, not comfort, not exactly. But something that was reaching toward both a man who had been standing on one side of something for 7 years, finally quietly, without fanfare and without certainty and with every reason to be afraid, taking one step toward the other side. He stood up and collected the cold coffee cups and set them in the basin without being asked. It was a small thing. Evelyn watched him do it and understood exactly how large it was. The cold coffee cups in the basin did not fix anything. Elias did not suddenly become a different man that evening, did not sit at the table with an open face and say the things that had been locked in him for 7 years. That was not how it worked, and Evelyn knew it was not how it worked, and she did not expect it to. What she expected was exactly what happened, that the next morning he was up before her, that the coffee was already made, that he was at the kitchen table with his newspaper in the same posture he occupied every morning, and that the only evidence of the previous evening was a slight difference in how he held himself when she came in. Some millimeter of reduction in the distance he kept at his own interior perimeter. She poured her coffee. She said good morning. He said good morning. The day began. This was enough. She had learned by now that with Elias Crow, enough was the thing you held on to and did not push past. Every time she had respected that boundary, had not pressed, had not filled silences he needed to keep, had not reached for things before he was willing to offer them, he had moved, slightly but verifiably, toward her. And every time she had watched some other person in town try to draw him out by force, Marcus Dillard, with his cheerful imposition, the preacher who had come out to the ranch once in May and left 20 minutes later, looking thoughtful, he had simply closed up and waited for the intrusion to pass. She was not going to be an intrusion. What she was, she had decided, was present. Just present. Every morning in the kitchen, every evening at the table, every Sunday in the garden with the children. Present without agenda. Present without performance. Just there, doing the work, being in the same space he was in, and letting him decide what to do with that. June arrived and brought the first real heat, the kind that settled into the valley by mid-morning and stayed until well past dark. The ranch had a rhythm to it now that was different from the careful provisional rhythm of the first weeks. It was more settled, more worn in, like a path through grass that has been walked enough times to know itself. Caleb was up at 5 to help with the horses, which had become over the weeks not a chore assigned but a habit chosen. He and Elias worked the barn in the early morning with the same economy of language they had used since the beginning. Caleb asked the right questions, and Elias answered them, and sometimes Elias showed him something without being asked, because the situation warranted it, and Caleb watched, and then did it, and usually did it right. There was the morning, in the 3rd week of June, when Elias handed Caleb the lead rope of the younger mare, the one that was still given to shying at unexpected motion, and said, without preamble, walk her twice around the corral. Keep your left hand steady, don't pull. Caleb took the rope. He walked the mare twice around the corral. His left hand was steady. He didn't pull. The mare settled into the walk without resistance. Elias watched from the fence. He said nothing when Caleb brought her back around. He simply nodded once and took the rope and led her back to the barn. Caleb stood in the corral with his hands at his sides, and the look of a boy who has just been trusted with something real and knows the difference between that and being trusted with something symbolic. He did not say anything either. He went and started on the water troughs. Evelyn saw this from the kitchen window. She was at the window a fair amount in those weeks, not watching exactly, more oriented toward the way you orient toward something that matters and are not ready to stop watching for its sake. She thought, Thomas would have liked him. This surprised her, because she had not thought about Thomas in relation to Elias before. She had thought about Thomas in relation to herself, to the children, to the absence that was shaped exactly like a person and would not fill in. But she had not placed the two men beside each other in her mind, and now that she had, what she found there was not rivalry or grief or comparison, just a kind of recognition. Thomas had been a man who showed love by doing things. Fixing the fence before you mentioned it needed fixing. Replacing the loose step without discussion. Leaving the good pieces of wood for Caleb's projects. His love had been practical and unremarked upon, and you only knew it was love because of the pattern of what he chose to do with his time and attention. Elias Crow showed love, she understood now, in exactly the same language. Different vocabulary, same grammar entirely. She turned back to the stove. It was Marcus Dillard who pushed the thing into the open, which was not what Marcus intended, but was the result nonetheless. Marcus had the habit of saying what other people were not saying, which he believed was a form of honesty, and which was sometimes honesty and sometimes meddling, and he did not always know which he was doing at the time. He came out to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late June, ostensibly to discuss a seed order, which they concluded in 10 minutes, and then he stood by his horse and did not immediately get on it. Town's been talking, Marcus said. Town always talks, as Elias said. He was repairing a hinge on the barn door. He did not stop. Different now, Marcus said. After what Hattie said in some church, most of the serious talk quieted down. But now they're talking about the arrangement. Wondering when you're going to... He paused, selecting his word. Formalize things. My arrangements are not the town's business, Marcus said. But the woman's reputation is her business. And the longer this goes without clarification, the harder it is for her when she goes to town. You know that. Elias looked up from the hinge. He looked at Marcus with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things that required a response before he was ready to give one. Are you telling me something I don't already know? He said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I'm telling you that what you know and what you're doing about it are currently two different things, he said, and then had the sense to get on his horse and go. Elias stood at the barn door for a while after Marcus left, holding the hinge. The afternoon was loud with the ordinary sounds of the ranch insects in the grass, the creek running, one of the horses moving in the corral. From the house faintly, he could hear Evelyn and Nora, some exchange about something Nora considered urgently important, and Evelyn was responding to with the particular patience she had for Nora's urgencies. He knew what Marcus had said. He had known it before Marcus said it. He had been knowing it with increasing precision for several weeks. The way you know a thing that is waiting for you to be ready to act on it, and you are working toward ready, and you cannot push the working. He rehung the hinge, he checked the door, he went inside. He did not bring it up that evening. He sat at dinner and watched his household, and he had, at some point in the previous weeks, begun to think of it as his household. All of them, in the way that a thing that has grown organically into a shape eventually just is that shape. And he thought about what Marcus had said, and what he himself knew, and what the distance was between knowing and doing. The distance was not practical. He had resolved the practical things. Evelyn had a home. The children had a home. The ranch was running better than it had in years. He was not afraid of the practical. He was afraid of the thing beneath it, which was that to say out loud what he was considering was to make it real, and what was real could be lost, and he had learned, with a precision that had never left him, what losing felt like. He knew this was not logical. He had built 7 years of his life on a version of this logic: if you do not have it, you cannot lose it. And he had been alone for 7 years, which was the consequence of that logic applied without mercy. He was not interested in applying it for another 7, but knowing the logic was broken and breaking it were different things. After the children were in bed, he sat on the porch. This had become a pattern, he on the porch. After dark, sometimes Evelyn, sometimes not. Tonight she came out after a while and sat in the chair she had come to occupy. And they looked at the night pasture in the way they had learned to look at things together, which was without requiring anything of the looking. After a while, he said, "I want to show you something tomorrow. In the morning, before the children are up." She turned to look at him. "Not far," he said. "The North Hill." She looked at him for another moment. "All right," she said. He nodded. They sat for another hour. The stars came out in the order they always came out, and the horses settled in the corral, and from somewhere in the valley a coyote started and then stopped. In the morning she was up at 4:30, which was before the household, which was what he had meant. He had the horses ready. They rode north in the early gray that preceded actual dawn, before the light committed to its direction, through the upper pasture and up the slope of the North Hill, which was not dramatic terrain, gentle rise, long grass, the cottonwoods thinning as the ground climbed. Evelyn rode beside him and said nothing, and he was grateful for that, for the fact that she seemed to understand the shape of moments without having to be told. At the top of the hill there was a flat place, a natural clearing, where the view opened to the south. The whole valley spread below. The ranch in the middle distance, the creek catching what light was starting to build in the east. It was a good piece of ground. It had always been good ground. There were 2 markers, wooden, well made, well kept. No elaborate carving, just names and years, because Elias was not a man given to ornamentation. But the markers were solid and the ground around them was clean, which meant he came here, which meant he tended it. Constance Crow, 1,851, 1,880. 76, 1,880. Evelyn dismounted. She stood a few feet back from the markers and did not move closer without permission. She looked at the names and she read the years, and she did the arithmetic that the years required. Constance was 29. Samuel was 4. She did not say anything. Elias stood beside her with his horse's reins in his hand, and he looked at the markers in the early light, and his face was not the controlled face he wore in town, or even the somewhat less controlled face he wore in his kitchen. It was something else, rawer, more unguarded, the face of a man who has come to a place where the performance is not necessary because the people here already know. "I brought them up here because they liked this view," he said. Constance did. Samuel was too young to have opinions about views, but Constance liked to see the whole valley from the top of things. He paused. "It seemed right." "It is right," Evelyn said quietly. "I come up here," he started, "not as often as I used to. The first year I came up every week, then once a month. Now he stopped, calculating. Maybe 6 times a year. "That's not a failure," Evelyn said. "That's just time." He looked at her. "People say it gets easier. It doesn't get easier," Evelyn said. "It gets different. There's a distinction." He looked at the markers again. "Thomas," he said. "Yes," she said. 2 years in March. "Does Caleb come up here with you?" "To wherever—" "There's no marker," she said. "We couldn't afford one, and then we were moving, and—" She stopped. "He knows where his father is. That's what matters." Elias was quiet. "He talks to him sometimes," Evelyn said. "Caleb, when he thinks no one can hear. In the way that boys talk to fathers they've lost quietly, and without expecting an answer." She paused. "I let him think I don't know." The first real light was coming over the east ridge now, the kind that commits everything in the valley becoming specific, the shadows going where shadows go in morning, the ranch below catching the first angles of it. Elias looked at it for a while. I built this place to hold myself together, he said, after. I mean that practically I put walls up, I put fences up. I fixed everything that was broken until there was nothing left to fix. And then I started on things that weren't broken yet, because as long as I was fixing things, I wasn't. He stopped. I wasn't just in a house where they used to be. Yes, Evelyn said. She knew this. She knew it from the inside. And then you came, he said. She waited, in the house that I had made. He turned and looked at her directly for the first time since they had arrived. It's still there. I can still see what I built. But you came in and you put curtains on the window and you put the molasses on the second shelf and you started a kitchen garden and Nora named the barn cat and Caleb asks me questions I have to think about to answer. And he stopped. And Rose looks at me like I'm something worth looking at. And I don't. His voice, for the first time in everything she had known of him, had something unsteady in it. Not broken, not falling, but present in a way it was not usually present. I don't know how to explain what that does to a man who spent 7 years, making sure no one would look at him that way again. Evelyn did not look away from him. I told you on the first day you came that there had been a mistake, he said. I need you to know. He stopped. Started again. I was wrong. About what the mistake was. I thought the mistake was that you came with 3 children. The mistake was thinking I could survive by never caring again. That was the mistake. He looked at the markers. Constance would have said that plainly a long time ago. She didn't have patience for the long way around things. She sounds like someone worth knowing, Evelyn said. She was, Elias said. She was also stubborn and particular about how she liked her coffee. And she argued with me about fence placement 3 separate times over 6 years, and she was right every time, which I did not admit while she was alive as often as I should have. He looked at the markers with something that was not the weight she had seen in him before, or rather it was that weight, but held differently, not with the closed quality of something trapped, but with the looser quality of something that has been acknowledged. I missed her, he said. I missed them both. For 7 years, that was the whole of what I was doing. And now, Evelyn said quietly. He turned back to her. The morning light was full now, and she could see his face clearly, every line in it. The scar along his jaw, the gray at his temples. The eyes that had spent 7 years learning to give nothing away and were at this moment not doing that. And now he said, I am missing them and also wanting something that is not missing at the same time, which I did not think was possible. He was quiet for a moment. Is it possible? Yes, she said, it's possible. I'm not offering you something undamaged, he said. I want to be honest. I'm not. This is not. He seemed to find this part harder than the rest of it, the part that was about the present rather than the past, and she understood why. Accounting for what you had lost was grief, which was practiced, which he had done. Accounting for what you were afraid to want was something else. I don't know how to do this without being afraid, he said. I want you to know I'm afraid. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. I came to Montana with 3 children and $20 and told a man I had never met that I could manage, she said. I was afraid every single day I was on that stage. I am afraid right now. She held his eyes. Being afraid is not the argument against it. Being afraid and deciding the thing is worth it anyway, that's the only argument that matters. He was very still. I'm not here because I had nowhere else to go, she said. I am here because this is where I want to be. I want you to know that too. The valley below them was fully lit now, the morning committed and ongoing, the ranch showing itself in the clear air, the barn, the corral, the house with its kitchen window where the curtain she had hung caught the east light, the garden just visible with its rows of beans and the squash just beginning to spread. Everything she had built into this place in 8 weeks was visible from up here, if you knew where to look. Elias looked at it, then he looked at her. I'd like to ask you to marry me, he said. Not because the town requires it, and not because the arrangement requires it. Because I want you here. Because I want your children here. Because this, he gestured, one short motion that encompassed the valley and the ranch and everything in it, is better with you in it than it was before. And I was a fool to think it could be anything but worse without you. Evelyn let out a breath. It was not a dramatic thing. It was the breath of a woman who has been holding something for a long time and has found a place to set it down. Yes, she said. He nodded. Some of the tension that had been in him all morning shifted and settled. He did not reach for her hand. He was not a man who moved toward that kind of thing easily or quickly, but he stood beside her on the hill in the morning light and looked at the valley, and some part of him that had been locked was not locked. They stood there for a while. It was a good place to stand. On the way back down, as the horses found the easier angle of the lower slope, Elias said, Caleb. She glanced at him. I'd like to talk to him, he said, before we say anything to anyone. He's old enough. And he paused. He deserves to be asked, not told. Evelyn looked at him for a moment, and she felt something move in her chest that had no clean name, but that was large and warm, and had been building for 8 weeks. Yes, she said, he does. Today, Elias said. Today, she agreed. Caleb was at the corral when they came back. doing the morning water troughs with the systematic attention he brought to things that required it. He heard the horses and turned and looked at them, both of them, together, coming from the North Hill at this hour, and his face did the quick reading thing it always did, gathering information. He did not say anything while they unsaddled. He finished the troughs. He put the bucket down. Elias came to the fence. He put his arms on the top rail and looked at Caleb in the corral, and Caleb looked back at him, and they were, Evelyn thought, more alike in this moment than either of them knew the same economy of posture, the same weight. "I want to ask your mother to marry me," Elias said. "I've asked her. She said yes, but I'm asking you." Caleb was still. "You've been the man of your family for 2 years," Elias said. "I'm not trying to take that from you. I am trying to—"
He stopped.
He was not a man who reached easily for the right word, and he did not pretend otherwise. "I would like to be useful to you," he said. "To all of you, in the way that a father is useful, if that is something you will allow." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working through something real, not performing consideration. Actually doing it. He was 9 years old, and he was doing it seriously, which was what 9 years of particular circumstances had made him. "My father," Caleb said carefully. He stopped. Started again. "I don't want someone to take his place." "No," Elias said. "I'm not taking any place. A place that existed stays where it is. I'm not asking for that." He paused. "I'm asking you to make room for something that's not the same thing, not a replacement, just something that's also true." Caleb looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked up. "Do you love her?" he said. Elias looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said. "I do," and Nora and Rose, "Yes." Caleb was quiet again. His jaw had the set of someone who is trying to make sure they are deciding correctly, who understands that this is a decision with weight. "Then okay," he said. Elias nodded. Caleb picked up the bucket. Then he stopped. "Elias."
"Yes."
"You're hard to know," Caleb said. "But you're easy to trust. I noticed that early." He looked at him for a moment. "I think that's rarer." He went back to work. Elias stood at the fence rail for a moment. Evelyn was watching from across the yard, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen there before, not the closed version, not the careful, composed version, but something underneath both of those, something that the conversation with Caleb had found its way to and touched. He was going to be all right. They were, she thought, all going to be all right, which was different from saying it would be easy or smooth or free of the ordinary difficulties of people trying to become a family out of the materials of very different histories. It would not be any of those things. There would be mornings when Elias was too closed, and she was too tired, and the children were too loud, and the ranch was too demanding, and all of it would pile up in the kitchen and require navigating. There would be nights when she lay awake and missed Thomas with a sharpness that still surprised her. There would be days when Caleb's particular gravity settled over him, and she could not reach him. There would be moments when Elias stood in the doorway of the back bedroom, and she would know without looking that he was standing there. All of that was coming. She was not naive about any of it. But also coming was this: a man who had been alone for 7 years, learning, slowly and without ease but with genuine will, how to stop being alone. Children who had been frightened and displaced and had made something out of Elias Crow's closed-up house through sheer presence and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being themselves. A kitchen that smelled like food and a garden that was growing, and a barn cat named Margaret, who had more or less decided that the porch was hers, and Nora, who had crossed a road and taken a strange man's hand and said a true thing, and had not understood that she was changing the direction of several lives when she did it, because she was 6 years old and she did not think in those terms. She just saw a person who looked sad and acted accordingly. It was, Evelyn thought, about as close to a beginning as anything she had ever witnessed. That evening after dinner, Elias sat with the children while Evelyn washed up. He sat at the table with Rose in the crook of his arm. Rose, who had decided some weeks ago that Elias was an acceptable place to be, and who had recently begun reaching for him specifically with the directness of babies, who have not yet learned to doubt their own instincts, and Nora on the bench beside him with Margaret on her lap, and Caleb across the table with his astronomy book open, and he did not look like a man who had arranged himself in this position. He looked like a man who was in the position he was in because it was where he was. Nora said, without looking up from Margaret, "Are we going to stay here?" "Yes," Elias said. Nora nodded as though this confirmed what she had already known. "I told Margaret," she said. "She's glad." "How can you tell?" Caleb said, not looking up from the book. "Her ears are forward," Nora said. "When she's glad, her ears go forward." She looked at Elias. "Did you know that about cats?" "I did not know that about cats," Elias said. "You should pay attention to the ears," Nora said seriously. "They tell you more than the face." Elias looked at her for a moment. The lamp was lit against the evening dark, and in the warm light Nora's face was the face of a child who was entirely where she intended to be, without complication or reservation, without the careful watchfulness that Caleb carried, or the measuring that Evelyn did. Just here, just entirely here. He reached over and tucked the ear of the astronomy book page flat so Caleb would not lose his place if he moved it. And then he adjusted Rose in his arm, and outside the window the Montana evening came down over the valley in the way it always did, slow and full and indifferent to the specific human arrangements it moved over. And inside the kitchen of the Crow Ranch all of it was warm and ordinary, and almost in the best possible way, enough. Evelyn came to the doorway. She looked at all of them, the lamp, the table, the book, the cat, the baby, the man. She leaned against the frame. Elias looked over at her. A long moment. Then he looked back at the valley through the window, and the faint curve at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to one she had seen on his face, and she thought, this is what it looks like when a man who stopped believing in things starts believing in one again. She went back to the dishes. She was smiling, which she did quietly, and to herself, which was how she preferred to hold the things that mattered most. Wedding was set for the second Saturday of September, which gave them 10 weeks, which Evelyn said was enough, and Elias said was fine, and Hattie Boone said was cutting it close if they wanted to do it properly, and then proceeded to define what properly meant with the specificity of a woman who had attended every significant event in Harrow Bend for 4 decades and had opinions about all of them. Evelyn had not planned to have opinions about the wedding. She had imagined something small, the judge, a few people, the ordinary paperwork of 2 adults making a legal arrangement. She had not imagined Hattie. Hattie arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the engagement, with a list written in her sharp, tilted hand, and sat at the kitchen table and went through it with the efficiency of a general reviewing a campaign. There would be the ceremony at the church. There would be a gathering after, not elaborate, but sufficient. There would be a proper dress, not a made-over traveling dress, a proper one. And Hattie knew a woman in Billings who sewed and could work fast. I don't need a dress from Billings, Evelyn said. You're marrying Elias Crow, Hattie said. Harrow Bend will be watching. They've been watching since April. Gives them something worth watching. Evelyn looked at her. You know I don't care what they watch. I know, Hattie said. But I do, and I've earned the right. She looked at the list. The dress is not for them, it's for you. Every woman deserves to feel like herself on the day she makes a decision this size. You'll wear something that fits and is clean and is not mended at the left sleeve. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, the left sleeve. She had not thought Hattie had noticed that on the first day. All right, she said. Hattie nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has won a reasonable argument and will not belabor it. She made her tea and stayed 2 hours and left with the list more annotated than it had arrived. And Evelyn sat at the table afterward and thought about what it meant to have someone arrange things on your behalf without being asked, not out of pity, not out of performance, but out of the specific kind of care that does not require your gratitude to justify itself. She had not had much of that. In the 2 years since Thomas died, the people who had helped her had mostly done so in ways that came with conditions. The family in Benton, whose help came with the understanding that she would be grateful and compliant, the women at the laundry who were kind but kept their distance, because a widow with children and no money was a fate they were all afraid of and did not want to stand too close to. Help with conditions was not the same as this. This was different. She thought she should probably cry about it. She didn't, because Nora would come in from the barn inside of 10 minutes, and Nora would want to know why, and the explanation would be too complicated for a 6-year-old. She started on the bread instead, and let the feeling be what it was while her hands did the work. Elias told Marcus, which meant by the following Monday the whole of Harrow Bend knew, because Marcus was constitutionally incapable of keeping significant information to himself for more than 48 hours. He told Clara, who told her neighbor, who told Adelaide Foss before the weekend was out, and from there it traveled at the speed that important news travels in small towns, which is faster than most other things. The response was not uniform. Vera Kettrick declared it long overdue and spent an afternoon reorganizing her opinion of Elias Crow upward, which he would never know and would not have cared about if he had. The preacher sent a note that was correct in all its forms. Several families who had been cool to Evelyn in town began to adjust, in the careful incremental way that communities adjust when a situation they have judged one way turns out to be going another, not with apology, because that would require admitting the judgment had been wrong, but with a slight thaw, a nod at the pump that had not previously been offered, an extra word at Mercer's. Adelaide Foss said nothing for 4 days, which Harrow Bend found more interesting than anything she might have said. On the 5th day she appeared at the ranch. Evelyn was in the garden when she heard the horse. She stood up and turned, and Adelaide Foss was dismounting at the front fence, in her good hat, with a basket over her arm. She looked like a woman who has made a decision and has committed to it even though the committing is uncomfortable, which is a specific posture that Evelyn recognized immediately. She came through the gate. She stopped at the edge of the garden. "I have come," Adelaide Foss said with the deliberateness of someone reading from an internal script, "to offer my congratulations." Evelyn looked at her. She held her garden trowel. Neither of them moved for a moment. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Adelaide looked at the garden. She looked at the curtain in the kitchen window. She looked at the house, the way a person looks at something that has changed while they were not looking, assessing the change, recalculating. She looked back at Evelyn with the expression of a woman who had spent several days composing her face for this moment. "I have not been," she stopped. "I was not fair to you," she said. "It came out the way things come out when they have been held in long enough that the release is slightly awkward, slightly compressed. I am aware of that." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought about what Hattie had told her, 30 years of being afraid, 30 years of dressing it as morality. She thought about the distance between understanding why a person is the way they are and forgiving them for what they have done with it, which was not the same distance, but was navigable. "I know things were said," Evelyn said. "I also know that you're here, which you didn't have to be." Adelaide looked at her. Something in the composed expression shifted. Slightly. "I brought preserves," she said, "for the table. My blackberry. People seem to find it adequate." "I'm sure it's more than adequate," Evelyn said. Adelaide set the basket at the garden's edge. She looked like she was about to say something else, and then thought better of it, and then said it anyway. "He was never unhappy before, Elias. He was contained. There's a difference, but since April she stopped. The man had a kitchen garden again. I didn't think I would live to see it." She adjusted her basket and walked back to her horse and rode away. And Evelyn stood in the garden with her trowel and watched her go and thought, people are almost never entirely what they appear to be from one direction. It's one of the things that makes them exhausting, and also one of the things that makes them worth the trouble. The weeks between the engagement and the wedding had the specific quality of time that is both abundant and insufficient abundant, because the days were full of ordinary work, the ranch and the children, and the season turning from high summer toward fall, and insufficient because underneath all of it, something was building toward a particular morning, and the building had its own momentum that could not be hurried. Elias was not a man who talked about his feelings at regular intervals, and this did not change. What changed was subtler: the way he occupied the house, the way he moved through the morning kitchen, the way he sat at the table in the evenings. He had been, since April, a man gradually unfreezing, and the unfreezing continued, not dramatically, not in ways that would have been visible to someone who had not watched it incrementally, but visible to Evelyn, who had watched every increment. He helped Caleb with the astronomy book on a Thursday evening without prompting, and they sat together for an hour, with the book open and the lamp close, and Caleb asking questions, and Elias answering them, and occasionally turning a question back. "What do you think? Before I tell you," because he was, Evelyn understood, a man who taught by making you find the edges of what you already knew. Caleb flourished under this completely. His particular kind of intelligence, careful, architectural, the intelligence of a boy who needed to understand how things connected before he could hold them, matched Elias's way of explaining, which was structural and without excess. She watched them from the doorway for a while, and then went to bed and left them to it, and fell asleep listening to the low alternation of their voices through the wall, which was one of the best things she had heard in 2 years. Nora, in the weeks before the wedding, developed the conviction that she should carry the ring. She expressed this conviction once, clearly, and then did not mention it again, which was not Nora's usual method, and therefore indicated that she understood. This was a matter requiring a different approach, patience rather than volume. It was Elias who came to her about it. He found her on the porch with Margaret on a late August afternoon, and sat on the step below her and said without preamble, "I would like you to carry the ring." Nora looked at him with brown eyes that gave nothing away. "I was waiting for you to ask," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You knew I would." "I thought you would," she said. "I didn't know." "There's a difference," he said. She nodded. She had, over the 5 months of living in this house, absorbed some of his language, not mimicking it, just incorporating it, the way children incorporate things from the people they are around most. "I'll be careful with it," she said. "I know you will," he said. She looked at him with the direct, unhurried look she had turned on him the first day, on the road in Harrow Bend, when she had crossed to him and taken his hand and said what she saw, with no understanding and no intention of the fact that she was changing the course of things. "Elias," she said. "Yes, can I still call you that?" She paused. "Or do you can call me whatever is true for you," he said. "You don't have to decide today." She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to important things. Then she picked up Margaret and put her in her lap, and Margaret settled without complaint, ears forward. "Okay," she said. He stood up. He put his hand on the top of her head for a moment, brief, light, The touch of a man who is still learning the language of this kind of tenderness but is applying himself to it, and then went back to the barn. Nora sat on the porch and looked at the valley and said to Margaret in a voice too low for anyone else, "Papa." She tried it out the way you try something on. She sat with it. Then she went back to watching the valley, apparently satisfied with how it fit. The morning of the second Saturday of September came in cold and clear, which was Montana doing what Montana did when it felt like being honest, the sky a hard bright blue, the first yellow showing in the cottonwoods, the grass along the upper pasture dried to gold. It was a beautiful morning, in the way that functional things are beautiful, without effort, without ornament, just exactly what it was. Evelyn was up before 4. This was not anxiety, or not only anxiety, it was just her, the same woman who had been up before 4 since the baby was born, and had not fully reclaimed her sleep even after Rose had slept through. She sat in the kitchen, in the dark, with her coffee, and she thought about Thomas, which she had known she would do, and had decided in advance not to be troubled by. She owed Thomas that. She owed him the acknowledgement that she had loved him, and that his absence was still a hole in the world, and that remarrying was not the erasure of what they had been. She thought, "Thomas, I found a good man. He is not you. He will never be you. But he is good and he is real, and he will take care of them." She sat with that for a while. Then she finished her coffee and went to get ready. The dress from the Billings seamstress was blue, not the pale apologetic blue of something chosen not to stand out, but a deep, clear blue that had been Hattie's specification, and that Evelyn had looked at when it arrived and thought, all right, yes. She was not a woman who dressed for rooms, but she was a woman who knew when something was correct, and this was correct. It fit properly, which was itself something she had not had a dress that fit properly in 2 years. She did her hair in the glass that hung on the bedroom wall, the one she had straightened on her 3rd day at the ranch, and which Elias had not commented on then or since. She looked at her own face in it with the frank assessment she applied to most things, not looking for beauty exactly, looking for the person she actually was versus the person the last 2 years had made her afraid she might be permanently. She found, looking, that she was still there, tired in ways that would take a long time to fully undo, older than she had been in Fayetteville by more than the months would account for, but there she was still there. They rode into Harrow Bend at 10, all of them together, Elias on his horse, Evelyn in the wagon with the children, the same road they had ridden the first time in April with the same distance between them, except that the distance now was different in kind, chosen rather than defensive. Caleb sat beside Evelyn on the wagon board, dressed in the new shirt that Hattie had acquired from somewhere without explaining how. He looked at 9 years old, like a boy becoming something not there yet, but pointed in a direction you could see. Rose was in Nora's arms in the wagon bed, dressed in white that Vera had made from a remnant of cloth she had been saving for something important and had decided this was finally it. Rose had been awake since 6 and was in an excellent mood, which was Rose's baseline, because Rose had been born into uncertainty and motion and had developed in her first year of life the profound equanimity of someone who has decided that wherever she is will do. Nora had the ring in a small cloth pouch in her coat pocket. She had checked on it 4 times between the ranch and town. Harrow Bend was already gathered. This was the thing Evelyn had not expected, the number of them. She had imagined a small ceremony, the few people who had been kind, the neutral parties. What she found was most of the town. They lined the path from the road to the church door, not ceremonially, not in organized rows, just present, the way towns are present for things that matter, gathered, watching, taking it in. She recognized faces as the wagon slowed. Vera Kettrick, who nodded once with an expression of complete satisfaction. Marcus Dillard with Clara beside him, Clara with her hands clasped and her eyes bright. Mrs. Aldrich from the school, who had told Caleb, apparently the previous week, that she expected him in his seat Monday morning the same as always. The Huss family from the neighboring farm, who had brought the potato sets in June and had not made a thing of it. Several faces she did not know well but had come to recognize the woman from the milliner, the man from the livery, the family with the red barn on the south road, and Adelaide Foss, standing near the church door, still in her good hat. Her face was composed in the way of a woman who has made a decision and is living with the living of it, which is harder than the deciding. She met Evelyn's eyes when Evelyn came down from the wagon. She did not look away. Evelyn nodded to her. Adelaide nodded back. It was not warmth exactly. It was something more durable than warmth. It was acknowledgement. The recognition of one complicated person by another, across the distance of everything that had been said and done, and the decision to let it be what it was and move forward. Elias was at the church door. He had dressed in his good clothes, which were clean and fitted, and which suited him in the way that plain things suited plain men without decoration. Just correct. He looked like himself, which was what he always looked like, which was enough. He looked at her when she came through the gathered people, and his face did not perform the occasion the way some men's faces did, no broad smile, no display. He just looked at her, and what was in his eyes was what she had learned to read over 5 months of learning his language. Everything he was not going to say out loud because he was Elias Crow, and some things lived in the action rather than the word. She stopped in front of him. "You look like yourself," he said. "Good," she said. "That's who I plan to be." Something at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he said. They went in. The ceremony was not long. The preacher, to his credit, understood that the occasion did not require elaboration, that the people standing at the front of his church had already done the harder thing, had already crossed the distances that mattered, and what was happening now was the naming of it. He kept it plain and honest, which was right. Nora carried the ring on a small cushion that Vera had produced at some point in the previous week, walking down the aisle with the focused solemnity of a child who has been given a real responsibility and intends to honor it. She did not drop it. She did not rush. She walked at the correct pace, and when she reached the front, she stood beside her mother and looked at Elias and held out the cushion, and her face said, "I told you I'd be careful." Caleb stood on Elias's side. This had been Caleb's choice. He had mentioned it to Elias on the Thursday before, with the matter-of-fact delivery he used for significant things, and Elias had said yes without making it into more than it was, which was what Caleb had needed. Hattie Boone sat in the front pew with Rose against her shoulder. Rose was looking around the church with the interested expression of someone who has arrived at a new place and is gathering data. She had a fist in Hattie's collar. Hattie held her with the ease of a woman who had held many children over 73 years and had not lost the physical memory of how. The vows were the words they had agreed on, not standard, not invented from sentiment, but chosen, which was different. Evelyn had written hers at the kitchen table in the early morning 2 days before, written them the way she wrote everything, plainly and without excess, and when she said them in the church, they were the same words she had written, which meant they were true. She said, "I am not offering you an easy thing. I am offering you what is real, which is that I will be here, with everything I am and everything I carry, for as long as I have." Elias had not written his. He said them the way he said most important things, without preparation. In the language he actually used, "I did not know how to want this. I learned. Because of you. I intend to keep learning." The preacher said the words that made it official. Elias took her hand, which was the most publicly tender thing Evelyn had ever seen him do, and held it in both of his, and looked at her. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that had no ceremony around it, just two people who had come from loss and distance and the specific loneliness of lives that had been interrupted, and had found each other in a way that was not romantic, exactly, was not the stuff of the stories that got told to children, but was real, which was rarer and worth more. Outside the church, in the September sun, Harrow Bend gathered around them in the way that towns gather when something has happened that they want to be part of imperfectly, not all of them wholeheartedly, but with the general motion of a community that has moved, incrementally and without full awareness, from judgment to something more honest. Marcus Dillard shook Elias's hand for longer than necessary and said something that made Elias look at him with the expression he used when people surprised him, which was rare. Clara Dillard embraced Evelyn with the warmth of a woman who has been waiting to do so since the first week, and is relieved to have the occasion. Vera Kettrick brought food, which she had organized with the same competence she organized everything, and set it up on tables outside, with the help of 2 other women who had offered the previous week, and whose offer Vera had accepted without ceremony, because help was help, and the occasion was the occasion. And Adelaide Foss brought the wedding cake. It was a good cake. Anyone could see that from the construction of it, the evenness of the layers, the way the icing sat. She had made it herself, which Evelyn knew, because Adelaide had that specific relationship to her own baking that people have with things they do well, and know they do well, and do not need to have confirmed, but would not refuse to have confirmed. She set it on the table beside Vera's food, and she looked at Evelyn and she said, "I made blackberry filling between the layers, since you didn't object to the preserves." "I did not object to the preserves," Evelyn said. "No," Adelaide said. She looked at the cake and then at Evelyn. "I am not," she stopped. "I am trying to be better than I was," she said. "I cannot promise the result, but that's the direction." "That's the direction that counts," Evelyn said. Adelaide nodded once briskly, in the manner of someone who has completed something difficult and prefers to move on. She went to get a plate of food and did not look back, which was also correct. Elias carried Nora out of the church. This had happened without planning. Nora had been beside him at the end of the ceremony, and he had simply reached down and picked her up, and she had gone up onto his hip with the ease of a child who has decided that this is a place she belongs. and he carried her down the church steps and into the September air with the same lack of ceremony he brought to everything. She had her arms around his neck. She was looking at the gathered town with the expression of someone surveying a situation from a height she found satisfactory. Evelyn walked beside him. Rose was back in her arms. Hattie had returned her with the observation that 10 months old was a good weight, and that she was not as young as she used to be, which Evelyn had accepted without comment. On her other side, Caleb walked with his hands in his pockets and his face in the open expression that was becoming more available to him as the months passed, as the weight of being 9 years old and the man of the family gradually redistributed itself. The four of them five, Nora would have said, if Margaret had been there, walked through the gathered people of Harrow Bend, and the September light came down on all of them, on the new grass of the churchyard, and the last of the summer flowers, and the horses tied at the rail, and the tables with Vere's food and Adelaide Foss's cake. It was not a perfect day. There were people there who had said things they had not apologized for. There were absences, Thomas's absence, Samuel's and Constance's absence, all the people who should have been there and were not. There was the ordinary difficulty of a community that had judged something it did not understand, and was now adjusting slowly and not always gracefully, toward something closer to right. None of that was resolved exactly. Not all wounds close on a schedule. Not all people become what they should. The world does not arrange itself tidily around human attempts to do better. But here was what was true. Elias Crow, who had been alone in 1,200 acres for 7 years and had built his solitude like a structure he intended to inhabit permanently, was walking out of a church with a child on his hip and a woman beside him and a 9-year-old boy at his side. The man who had pointed his finger at Evelyn Hart on the first day of April and said, "Take them back," was carrying the same woman's daughter through the same town where he had said it, and his face was not the face of a man who had been defeated or surrendered. It was the face of a man who had been wrong about something important and had found out in time and had done the harder thing, which was not admitting the mistake but changing after it. That is not a small thing. Most people do not do it. Most people find reasons not to too old, too set, too much water under that particular bridge, too afraid of what the changing will cost. Elias Crow had every one of those reasons and had set them aside, not because it was easy and not because he stopped being afraid, but because the alternative was another 7 years in a house, with 17 rooms and no curtains, and a cat with no name and boots in a back bedroom that never moved. He had chosen differently. In the late afternoon, when the gathering had settled into its final quiet, and most of Harrow Bend had drifted home and the children were fed, and the cake was 3/4 gone, Elias and Evelyn sat on the church steps. The others were around the corner, Caleb watching the horses with Marcus's boy, Nora explaining something to Vera, Rose asleep against Hattie's shoulder in the chair that had been brought out for her specifically. The September air was cooling. The cottonwoods down the road had gone further toward yellow since morning. Evelyn had her hands in her lap. Elias had his elbows on his knees. They were not touching, which was not absence, but just the way they were two people who had learned each other's language, and in that language, this proximity, this shared silence, was its own kind of contact. In April, Evelyn said when you told the driver to take us back, "What would you have done if Nora hadn't crossed the road?" He thought about this honestly. "I don't know," he said. "I would like to believe I would have found my way around to the same place eventually." He paused. "But I don't know that. She's always been like that," Evelyn said. "Even when she was 3. She just walks toward whatever needs walking toward." "She's going to be formidable," Elias said. "She already is," Evelyn said. He looked down the road. "I owe her something. I don't know what you give a 6-year-old to account for the fact that she changed the direction of your life." "You give her what you've been giving her," Evelyn said. "You answer her questions. You let Margaret on the porch. You're there." He was quiet for a moment. "Being there," he said. 7 years ago I thought I was doing that, staying on the land, keeping the ranch running, being there." He paused. "That's not the same as being there." "No," Evelyn said. "It's not. There's a difference," he said, and she heard in it the echo of all the times he had said exactly those words. The small, consistent philosophy of a man who had learned, at great cost, that distinctions matter, that the gap between what something appears to be and what it is can be the size of a life. She looked at him. He was looking at the cottonwoods, at the yellow showing in them. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "For the hill, for telling me about them." He held her eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for not telling me it would be all right. I didn't know that it would be." "I know," he said. "That's why it mattered." They rode home in the early evening, the wagon moving north on the same road that had brought Evelyn south in April, in a different direction now, in a different condition entirely. The sky above the valley was doing what Montana skies do at the end of a clear September day, going through colors that did not have adequate names, the blue deepening towards something that was almost violet at the edges, the west still holding the last of the sun's red. Nora was asleep in the wagon bed with Margaret's twin, the ranch cat, which had somehow arrived in the wagon at some point in the afternoon, and which no one had removed. Caleb was awake beside Evelyn, looking at the sky with the contemplative expression he wore when he was thinking about large things. Rose was asleep against Evelyn's side, the sleep of a baby who has had a full and eventful day and has surrendered to it completely. Elias, Caleb said, after a while. Without looking away from the sky, the stars come out in order. What order? Elias said. The brightest ones first, then the medium ones, then the small ones. He paused. Mrs. Aldrich says it's because the bright ones are larger or closer or both, but it looks like order, like they're taking turns. Most natural things have order in them, Elias said, if you look long enough. Did you know that before you looked? Caleb said. Or did you have to look first? Elias considered this the way he considered things that deserved it without rushing to the answer. I had to look, he said. Most things you have to look at first. Caleb nodded. He seemed satisfied with this, in the way of a boy who has been asking questions all his life, and has finally found a person who answers them at the correct depth. The ranch came into view below the north ridge. The house, the barn, the corral. The kitchen window catching the last of the western light, Evelyn's curtain visible in it. The small piece of fabric she had hung in the second week, that had meant what curtains mean when someone puts them in a window that has been bare for 7 years. I am making this a place. I intend to be here. Elias brought the wagon through the gate. The horses settled. The evening sounds of the ranch came up around them, the creek, the grass, the ordinary quiet of 1,200 acres that had been worked and tended, and were at this moment at rest. Evelyn lifted the sleeping Rose and stepped down. Caleb jumped from the wagon board. Elias lifted Nora, who barely stirred, and carried her toward the house with the sure-footed ease of a man who has done this before, or who has found, in the last several months, that his body remembers things his mind had tried to set aside. The door opened. The house was warm. Vera had arranged for someone to keep the stove fed during the day, because Vera arranged things. The lamp was lit in the kitchen. Nora woke up enough to say, into Elias's collar, "Did Margaret come home?" "The barn cat is in the wagon," he said. "Her name is Margaret," Nora said with the patience of someone who has made this correction many times. "Margaret is in the wagon," he said. "Good," Nora said, and went back to sleep. He carried her to the back bedroom and laid her in her bed, and she settled without waking, one hand under her cheek. He stood for a moment in the doorway. Then he pulled the door to and went down the hall. He passed the other back bedroom, the one with the wooden horse and the boots, and he stopped. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he opened the door. He went in, which he had not done, fully in for months. He crossed the room and picked up the wooden horse and turned it in his hands. It was a good horse. He had made it himself, had spent 3 evenings on it, had given it to Samuel on a birthday that was now a date in the past that he kept without needing to mark it. He set it back down on the windowsill where it could be seen. He picked up the boots. He held them for a moment. Then he set them beside the wooden horse together on the sill. He stood back and looked at them. He said quietly and to no one or to someone, "I haven't forgotten. I'm not going to forget. But I'm not going to be stopped by you anymore, and I think you'd understand that. I think that's what you'd have wanted." He pulled the door open rather than closed and left it. Evelyn was in the kitchen when he came back, Rose already put down, Caleb taking himself to bed with the self-sufficiency he had always had, and that she hoped, in time, he might need to rely on a little less. She was making tea, which was the thing she did at the end of days that had contained too much for simple processing. She looked up when Elias came in. He looked different. She was not sure she could have said precisely how there was nothing externally changed. Same face, same posture. But something had shifted in the quality of him, in the way he came into the room. Lighter, maybe. Not lighter like less serious. Lighter like something set down. She did not ask. She put a cup in front of him, and he sat down, and she sat across from him. And they drank their tea in the quiet kitchen with the lamp between them. After a while he said, "I left the door open." She looked at him. "The back bedroom," he said. "I left the door open." She held her cup and did not say anything, because what she felt was too large for the kind of words that could be said in a kitchen at the end of a wedding day, was the kind of thing that lived in the body rather than the mouth, and the body's language for it was this. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked at her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held it. They sat like that for a while. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the September night settled over the valley with the patience of a thing that has all the time it needs. The creek ran north. The cottonwoods stood in the dark with their yellow just beginning, the season making its way through its changes in the order that seasons make their changes, not asked, not rushed, just moving through what it is toward what it is next. There is a thing that people say about courage, that it is the absence of fear, or the overcoming of it, or the refusing of it. These are all wrong. Courage is simpler and harder than any of those things. Courage is what Elias Crow had done, not the grand gesture, not the dramatic declaration, but the quiet and terrifying act of deciding that something was worth being afraid for, and then doing it afraid, and then doing it again the next day, and the day after that, and not stopping. That is what love asks of a person. It does not ask for certainty. It does not ask for a heart that has not been broken. It asks only for the willingness to risk the breaking again, because the thing on the other side of that risk is the only thing that makes a life feel like a life, rather than an arrangement for surviving one. A 6-year-old girl had known this on a Tuesday morning in April. She had crossed a road and taken a sad man's hand and said what was true, because she had not yet learned that seeing what is true and saying it are supposed to be two different things. She had not been wrong. The lamp burned. The house was full of sleeping children, and one barn cat who had decided that the kitchen rug was hers and was not wrong about it either. The man who had called this family a mistake sat at his own kitchen table and held his wife's hand, and outside his valley lay dark and quiet and very large, and it was his and it was theirs, and for the first time in 7 years that was not a difference.